Sorry, this is going to end up being a cut it and post thing.
Yeah, no problem.
I was not honestly expecting us to be on this long.
I have a feeling I'm just going to say, here's a weird 2 hour episode, which is totally outside of our format, but you know what? We haven't put out an episode in a few weeks, so enjoy this, and then we'll get back to our regular scheduled stuff after that. Welcome to episode 40 of Upshift, No Direction Network's podcast that gives you an edge on Essence 20. I'm Ryan Costello, one of the designers of the Essence 20 system and an author on over a dozen Essence 20 projects from Renegade Game Studios. Before we begin, although I have worked for Renegade on Essence 20, Upshift is not associated with or produced by Renegade Game Studios. This is not an official Essence 20 podcast, and all opinions shared herein are my own or my guests'. Now, longtime listeners might have noticed I've told a few anecdotes about my friend Charles. He's someone I met on the internet when I got into the online world of adult G.I. Joe fans, and has grown into a close friend. So recently he offered to fill in as a co-host on Upshift whenever I needed someone to bounce a topic off of. Today, I'm taking him up on that offer, and that topic is him. So welcome to the show, Charles Cushman.
Hello, Ryan. I'm glad to be here. I've just recently kind of binged all of these ones, and it was a very heartfelt goodbye that I've just recently been through in the goodbye episode for the previous person we were working with here. And I'm feeling, it's with mixed emotions I come in. I am certainly not anywhere near as experienced as the last person to sit in this seat, but I am super happy to be here and get a chance to talk about all of the things that we've been talking about for the last 20 years.
Must have been a journey, because more than any other podcast that I've had on the network, Upshift has been through a lot of ups and downs really quickly.
Mm-hmm. And when you binge them all at once,
yep,
really quickly. So it's been very, very it's been interesting to watch this journey, and it's now even more interesting to be a part of it. So,
well, I've always wanted to fill the second seat with somebody whose knowledge of the topics isn't redundant with mine, and so that's why I didn't reach out to a lot of my friends in the G.I. Joe fandom. But I think, first of all, I think you're a great co-host because you and I have great chemistry. We've had long, entertaining conversations that I've remembered for years afterwards, and you're a very knowledgeable person with great insight into not just G.I. Joe, but popular culture and really the world at large and the zeitgeist and psychology. I've always admired your brain, so I am enjoying having you on for this. But I also like that we both have experience with G.I. Joe. We both have experience with games. But I've pivoted towards game design, and you have been casual in the game design field, but have been an avid gamer. And so I think that different perspective will give us an opportunity to have talking points. Because the reason I didn't want a redundant co-host is because then I don't want to talk to somebody that knows everything I'm saying. I want them to learn at the same time as the audience and have a chance to have the questions that the audience might have.
And one of the good things about, I guess, the last 20 years is every once in a while, we just didn't talk for a year or two. And it would be like, oh, Ryan, what are you up to now? Well, I did this amazing thing. Oh, that's great. Well, what are you up to now? Oh, well, your favorite webcomics. Yeah, I now work for that company. Oh, really? Okay. And what's that? Well, I've done a whole new RPG based on the thing that we know and love. Oh, okay. And so it's always been kind of this, you might disappear for a year, but when you come back, it's like totally worth it because the thing that you've been working on has been so massively impressive. So I'm looking forward to that. And I might actually be able to talk about a couple of things now that you don't even know about me. So,
Well, I do want to start with your origin story and how you even got into G.I. Joe and, how that affected your early life. So let's start there, because some of this I know and some of this I don't know. So I expect I'll be learning right at the beginning. What got you into G.I. Joe?
Well, I mean, like everybody in my age grade area, that sort of thing, it was the one social event that everybody kind of was tied to. The after school cartoons were something that everybody was there. Transformers, Thundercats, all of the 80s properties that we know and love. They were the things that we talked about in the schoolyard. There was an enormous amount of cachet to being the person who had that year's like fold out calendar with all the pictures of the toys that were coming up. The first person to get that was like the center of the schoolyard for, whatever time until the products came out. And you kind of had to usually go to the States in order to be able to get those calendars and have access to them. So you could actually see what those products were. So it was a very, I wouldn't say it was competitive, but I wouldn't also say it was cooperative either. It was a very important part of the social life of a grade six to actually, know and have an appropriate either Transformers or G.I. Joe collection. I didn't have a lot of stuff back then. In fact, that kind of will certainly tie me into where I ended up as an adult collector and how I ended up with all the bins I have now. But at the time, it was just a very, very important part of it. There weren't really, other than the Japanese things that came over, there weren't really toys and cartoons really tied together for legal reasons in the U.S. Once that changed, it really changed everything, and we were able to kind of have the thing, play with the thing, watch the thing, read the thing, and it really just changed everything there. So most of when my friends came over, we played GI Joe. When we went over to their houses, we played GI Joe, and it was the reason to get together.
One of my most vivid memories of not the fold out catalogs, but the card back, which also acted as, they call it a cross sell. I didn't realize it. But yeah, it was the catalog of what else is out there. One of my most vivid memories was a kid had snuck it onto a school bus, which we weren't really supposed to do, and was explaining to me how the 1987 characters related to each other, because I mostly got my lore through the cartoon, but they were reading the comic, and the cartoon ended after the movie, so most of 1987 hadn't gone in there, and he was explaining to me, it's like, this says it's Cobra Commander, but he's not Cobra Commander, because of this guy, Raptor. He was like in on swapping out who the guy under the Cobra Commander mask is, and I was just like, what are you talking about? How did they replace Cobra Commander? And, of course, the last I saw Cobra Commander, he turned into a Snake Man, so the whole thing was not computing for me because the idea of multiple continuities didn't make sense at the time. But that story does involve Raptor, which is also your online handle. So I'm curious what it was about that character that you adopted his name as your online persona.
So it was quite funny because my favorite character growing up was Ripcord. Absolutely loved Ripcord, loved everything about Ripcord. Best figure ever. So I went and tried to join a place called the Bivouac, which turned into Joe Customs. And Ripcord was already taken. Ripcord with any numbers that I was interested in having was already taken. So I'm like, okay, well, what other names are there? And I kept doing searches and hitting nothing. I'm like, okay. So I'm in Toronto at the time. And so I type, okay, you're Toronto Raptor. And that was not taken. So I'm like, okay, well, I guess I wonder, Raptor's a really cool name. Like, I mean, Raptor at the time was the big combat jet that was in the US. And it's a really cool name in every other fandom but ours. And so I'm like, Raptor, and it worked. And I'm like, okay, that's a really cool name. And it would anywhere else it would be taken, but here it was not. And I found that any job board that I was on anywhere always had it free because somehow the fear of a shirtless man wearing a bird cowl and a big cape just had set such a sense of uncool on the word Raptor that I was able to be it. So that became my online identity, and I actually learned to like the figure because I'd taken the name rather than the other way around.
I never made the Toronto Raptor connection. And yeah, and the fighter jet, that also makes sense. But yeah, I always assumed it was maybe some kind of ironic appreciation for the, Birdman accountant. It's funny, I remember 87 vividly, and I like it's kind of looked at as a dark year for G.I. Joe, especially on the Cobra side. But I love Crocmaster. Unironically, I think he is such a cool design and a fun concept. And I enjoyed Raptor as a kid. Crystal Ball was the one that I remember being like I got him and cried. I literally was like, I've waited for my birthday and this is the toy I got. But I didn't realize the hate for Raptor until I got online and people were like, here are all the worst toys and why. And Raptor was always very close to the top of that list.
No, and at the time I was very into bird handling because my wife Dorian, she's a bird handler and was worked
What?
in
I didn't know
yeah.
that.
Yeah, I worked in, she worked in bird, so at the university that she was at, she worked in the wild bird clinic, helped basically injured birds recover. And so she was assigned a turkey vulture named Socrates, who just absolutely, absolutely loved this bird. It was a wonderful bird. And if you ticked it off, it would like throw up for like 40 feet and just shoot the contents of its stomach out. So you didn't want to tick it off. But you really got to learn more about these birds, and so having a bird on the glove is just it was at the time very natural for Dorian. So being part of that world, I'm like, no, falconry is actually really really cool and has a very very long history that which I'd been told by my wife. So I actually did have that information, but yeah, it was really the whole bird handling aspect of it and how it was there. That really came from my wife being so immersed in that world. And it's like, yeah, steel chip claws on a bird or prey. I mean, if it doesn't get shot, could absolutely do a lot of damage to somebody. And that's something that that if they're telling you that it can't be, it could actually be, and was explaining why. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I actually was kind of forearmed with this knowledge that this was sort of it was something that was real, and it was something that for thousands for like a thousand years back kind of thing. Rich people were able to use them for hunting and able to use them to identify prey and all of the sort of stuff that people do now. And they were kind of the first aerial reconnaissance platform. And if you kind of think about them like that, they're really cool. So it was not, again, it was kind of growing into this was the name. And thus I started to identify with the character and the pieces around it rather than me liking it as it was. That being said, I did have a picture of him and my least favorite one of my least favorite vehicles, the Slam, but also Outback and Tunnel Rat was the cover of one of the, I think
It was
it's
with the UK, the Action Force comics, right?
yeah, and so they'd blown that up into a poster, and I probably got it out of one of the reprints of the Action Force things now that I think about it, but had that up on my wall. And so I was already predisposed to like this because in the comics, it's certainly a very cool looking figure. If it would have been in a Marvel comic, it would have been a very, in a Marvel superhero comic. Then it would have been kind of one of those things that would stick in the mind. But of course, in the setting that it was in, and with the absolute derision, which I think the writer, who was forced to adopt a military comic to a dude that dresses up as a bird, was able to treat it like I was on a podcast previously, we were discussing it, and it said it's like one of the best call outs was that he goes, Cobra Commander goes, I'm sick of dealing with all of these people in crazy costumes. And it's like, yeah, that was probably Larry Hama kind of just what was on his mind at the time, which was this is crazy. This is supposed to be a military comic. So, but yeah, I mean, I very much grew into loving the character. All the various different weird little bits of it turned into something which was good, and I bought into that mythos. That's where I ended up.
Well, there were a couple of things about that first Raptor appearance in the comics that I appreciated. One of them is that Larry Hama seems to be like a real anti-capitalist, and anytime Hasbro was like, here's a wacky idea, he was like, great, here's how it's actually an evil business person. Like the twins, here's Cobra Evil Acrobats. Acrobats, oh, you mean the people that are actually behind the company that is illegally using white-collar crime to fund Cobra. Like, no, that's not what we meant, but okay. Here's this, bird handler. You mean bird handler / accountant? And then later when they introduce Cesspool, the same thing. It's like, yeah, he's the evil eco-terrorist. Yes, because he ran a business that ignored environmental laws and got scarred by his own sludge. Like, Larry Hama loved taking down business people, especially like the billionaires, and making them Cobra characters. But I think he legitimized Raptor in one moment where he had just a flock of falcons, each one with a different ribbon on his talon, sent them off, and the one that came back was that told him what direction that the Joes were in. And it's like, oh, there's actual like military-esque applications for this character. I get him now, and I really appreciated that.
Oh, and then he took that information of what direction they were, and sorry, no, he found out where to look for them in the first place by hacking a Pentagon database with everybody's financial records in it. And I'm just like, okay, see, you're really like on anyone else, that would have been the main story there, right? Like that is the 90s hacker, would have been wearing a hoodie, and on a skateboard, kind of super cool hacker guy. And they just kind of brush over that, saying, hey, he's an accountant. Of course, he can hack into a secure database in the Pentagon with all sorts of information in it. Can't everyone? That's a standard accounting skill. So it was very interesting how they really kind of gave him a really interesting set of skills there, and then just was like, okay, we need to get rid of him now because bird suit, weird.
The just that mention of the hacker in the hoodie. Had GI Joe Renegades ever brought in Raptor, I could totally see him just being putting on a hood, and it just happens to be like a bird cowl type hood. Now oh man, that
I
would have been
love that.
awesome.
I love that. I unambiguously love that.
Yeah,
Set of earphones on like this, and the bird cowl thing pulled over is, oh
yeah.
yeah, that is fire. I love that.
All right, but you mentioned the bivouac, so that is also the message board that first brought me into GI Joe. The first website that brought me into the GI Joe online community was Yojo, and Yojo had after I went through every single link, I saw one link was for customs, which was on their front page. I'm like, well, that sounds cool, and I clicked on it, and they were like, we're no longer hosting customs. It was getting too big, but here's a link to the bivouac where people were they're just going there for customizing. So even though I wasn't a customizer, I was looking for a message board where I could have a lot of online conversations with Joe fans, and so I got into the bivouac, which, like you said, then became Joe Customs. What brought you to the bivouac?
So it was very weird. I find that like that whole just when you're trying to get out, they pull you back in thing seems to be my experience with GI Joe because in 2000 I just moved to or slightly before 1999 I moved to Toronto and I had no space to store my GI Joes anymore. I had this big collection of bins of GI Joes and I was looking at getting rid of them. So I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to go on this place called Online and find out what these things are worth so I can try and sell them. And first person I ran into was a guy named Pete. And Pete was like, "Oh yeah, well there's a whole artistic community around. There's all this." I'm like, I didn't realize people were still into these things. So I sold him a few things, and he introduced me to Joe Customs, and all of a sudden I was hooked. Right? I was just oh wow, everything that was wrong about figures, they're fixing. Everything that wasn't released, they're releasing. Like all of these cool. I didn't even think that you could do these things, and I also had friends who played Warhammer, and I wasn't particularly interested in Warhammer because it was the lore just didn't catch me. But you could use all the painting skills and things like that to be able to do it. But more importantly, Bivouac first, and then Joe Customs otherwise. I found that most of the communities, particularly collector communities, are very competitive. They're very they're gatekeeping. They're competitive. Before we even knew what gatekeeping actually like. Before we knew that that was a word, I really experienced it through those other ones. It's like either you know a lot and have a lot, or you're nobody. And when I ran into Bivouac first and Joe Customs afterwards, it was a artistic community, which is an entirely different vibe than what you would get out of a collector's community because collectors are all going after a few rare things or a bunch of things or a big size of things, whereas artistic communities are more like encouraging or I did this way. You need to do this way. And this will work out really well if you do this way, and showing off the sort of artistic pieces. So it wasn't as competitive. Obviously, there were people who were more skilled and less skilled, but it was incredibly encouraging and supportive. And that's really what I wanted out of an online community at the time. And so I kind of fell headfirst into there, and I didn't end up getting rid of my the rest of my GI Joes. In fact, I started accumulating more of them. And then kind of the being able to have some control over what these toys look like and where they would go, and that was it was incredibly empowering to someone who I really didn't have a lot of money or ability to be a maker at that point. Like all the tools that we have now are would have been astounding to me in 1999. But this was a way that I could create things and make things with a tiny little apartment and just a little desk with a pot of paint on it. So I really got into it from there. And we'll talk about again kind of how I've just recently got into it again, but I just recently got it again because I was trying to get rid of my collection again. So that's kind of that theme will come back. But at the time, there was really not a whole lot like Joe Customs in that it was an almost unambiguously positive and hilarious community, very comedy focused, and that's really what drew me into it.
Yeah, the comedy still sticks with me. Like, I don't know if it was just because we were a creative bunch or if we just happened to have a couple of funny members in the community that really just made the whole thing seem funny. But man, like, I would go there for my entertainment and for my G.I. Joe customizing, or sorry, my G.I. Joe conversation. And slowly it brought me into customizing, which was easy to do with G.I. Joe because, G.I. Joe was always the cheapest toy you could get. You could have 100, or maybe not 100, you could have a dozen G.I. Joes as a kid and not even be a G.I. Joe fan. It was so easy and so cheap to get them. And so when we got back into collecting, people were just selling lots on eBay of here's 50 guys. And if I only needed 20 of those guys, that's okay. Because now the other 30 were custom fodder for, I always had plans for customs. I've made maybe 10 customs in my life, not counting the Canadian G.I. Joe convention stuff, which I'll get to in a second. But yeah, like like it was, I fairly quickly suddenly had the material to do the community, the customizing part of it, and this community that was encouraging me to do it. Man, some of my highlights of the community, one of them was a tip that you got, which was writ dyeing, which is
Mm.
that if you just take this clothing dye, put it and some G.I. Joe parts into a crock pot, you could change the base color of it. And so that like really like it covered the basic steps of getting the customizing done. You just figured out what color you wanted the most part of this part to be, and then you would just paint the highlights, which was super useful. And then the other tip that was just mind blowing to me, and I never did this, but somebody figured out that there was a product called Hydrospan that if you apply it to a different scale action figure part, you could shrink it or grow it so that they were taking the pro wrestlers, like the 8-inch toys, and shrinking their heads so that they were to scale to 4-inch toys. And it was mind blowing how perfectly those parts fit together. And those were the kind of tips that you would get on Joe Customs. In fact, they put together a whole wiki of just these are toy customizing tips that I still think about to this day.
And that was that's really where like we look now at 3D printing or other maker communities, right? And they're all sort of like that. That's the what the success of a maker community is. We would not have called Joe Customs a maker community back then because we didn't have those words, right? We wouldn't have called what we were doing memes back then, but we were doing memes before memes were cool. We had peach pants and big brawler and all this kind of stuff, and just these things which became shorthand and not to exclude people, but just kind of the funny things that we cottoned onto and continued to put forward. So it was very much the model of what you would find a maker community being right now. But at the time, there weren't really a whole lot of things like it. There just weren't. And we hit at a certain time as well where digital cameras became popular. And before that, it was really hard to get pictures really of any sort of quality onto the internet of any work that you were doing. And then it was getting hard to, find some ways to host it because your MySpace site had limits and the technology at the time was very limited. But they did put these things up and they were in a gallery and you were part of this. You could see all the other people's work and all their inspirations. And that was, and the pictures kept getting better and better. And it was a really, I think it was unlike anything else that I could have found. Even Warhammer had difficulty ever getting into that kind of relatively creative, positive makerspace model. And yeah, I loved it. I love to this day. It has faded away, as have all, things that had a really good run. But it really got me into a makerspace that I never left. It moved from one place to another, and I make different things. But it definitely put me there. It also, and this is, I guess, one of the parts you don't know, um, there was a lot of work to be done for people who wanted either large scale customization or kind of on the edges of things customization. Particularly, foreign figures were extremely expensive to be able to obtain. And there were some patterns that can be made fairly quickly or easily, either with writ dye or parts combinations. And so people would reach out to me and say, I want a character that looks like this. I want a Tiger Force shipwreck. I probably created about 30 or 40 of those. for people as custom builds. And there was really at the time a lot of negativity around making duplicates or near duplicates of expensive stuff. So I kept that one on the down low. The other piece was, and I think we're going to get into the conventions a bit, but you talked a bit about how there was like these massive lots of cheap figures that were out there, and around that time, or when we were looking at this sort of thing, at the heyday of it, there were these things called anti-builders, and so there were army builders, right? And then they were packaged with a named character in GI Joe, and nobody wanted 100 of that named character GI Joe. They wanted 100 of the faceless Cobra that went with it. And so you could very routinely get for $1 or $2 a perfectly new, perfectly good action figure. And so I managed to get numerous different kind of people who are like, yeah, you want to buy my extras? I'm like, of course I do. So I ended up with these massive catalogs of all of the same figure. And we were also getting into customized heads at the time. People were actually molding and customizing things like that. So I ended up doing quite a bit of small convention work where I would do 40 or 50 of the same customs. However, unfortunately, the convention running people, which I was working with on different levels, they were competitive and they were not super happy to share talent or ideas or things like that. So, but and there's a downside of that though. A lot of people came up with ideas and then were never able to completely pull them through. So I have a lot of 20 or 30 run figures that never actually went anywhere and didn't actually go to the convention that they were intended to do. So a lot like I was doing some stuff in the background with larger scale work, but I was never super comfortable with sharing that with the community because it really it provoked controversy or it provoked people, going at each other, and that was never my intention, right? I would rather, not put those things forward. But that's something as I'm going through my collection now to put it together to sell it, I'm like, oh, I remember this. This was for a convention for something. And then at the last minute, the heads didn't come through. Or I remember this one's there, but the backers fell through for it. And so I was kind of going through this and like going through, oh my God, I was the worst freelancer ever. I didn't know about taking money in advance. I didn't know. And so I think about the fact that my work on the site and my reputation is created through the site actually provided me a lot of what turned out to be terrible opportunities, but did get me a lot of press about being able to do certain things and work at certain scales. And I really absolutely, it was really beneficial. I learned an awful lot about how not to do things, but also how to do things. And there are some regrets that I have about work that I did and how I built contracts around it, but all of that informed how I would do things, in my professional life and everything else. So it was an enormously positive overall experience to be on those boards.
Now, obviously, you're being vague and not naming names, and that's fine. Are you okay going into the Canadian GI Joe meets and conventions?
I am absolutely okay with that.
All
I
right.
almost pulled this little guy out
Oh,
when
nice.
you started talking about Rit dying because everyone talks about Black Ice, and I have a couple of the figures here, so when we talk about them, I can bring them out, and some prototypes too. But this one is, I think, the lowest run Canadian convention exclusive, because you did all of them.
Yeah, so it wasn't actually with the official Canadian meet. It was with a Montreal meet that I was running myself, but kind of like modeling after the Canadian GI Joe meet and conventions. And we're kind of telling the story out of order, but since
Oh,
you brought
sorry.
up the Canada Pride backstop, which I call that because he's got this red Canada sweater, that's actually based on this sweater that I'm wearing now that I picked up on one of my trips to Toronto for a Canadian GI Joe convention. Yeah, and with a white shirt, he's kind of lined up like the Canadian flag. And yeah, like you were saying, the idea was to make a custom as the door prize or like the incentive to go to the convention. And yeah, I think I made 25 of them and only 10 or 15 people made it. So there were a lot of extra pieces there. But I also had a lot of learning experiences there. I had somebody cast the backstop heads so that I had enough heads for all of them without having to sacrifice my actual action figures. I asked for them to cast it in a flesh tone, but he cast it in white. And so then I tried to find a flesh tone like a Caucasian flesh tone dye, and I ended up with a very peachy color, and so the colors are a little off. And then I dyed the torso red because the jacket was the predominant part of it, and then painted white over it, not realizing that the red of the dye then started leaking into the white of the shirt. And so there's like 20 layers of white paint on them, and it's still a little bit pink on most of the ones that I made. So yes, it was a learning experience, and it is funny that I made more of that backstop than I did for, which I guess for people that don't know, Backstop was the first Canadian member of G.I. Joe. He's from Montreal, just like me, and so I always glommed onto him as my mascot character, even though for whatever reason I didn't use his name for message boards. But yeah, so then the novelty of this Canadian convention bringing out like so many Canadian fans, I felt like when I'm doing the Montreal equivalent, Backstop is definitely the character that I should be doing, and that one is unofficial, not acknowledged by Hasbro or anything. But I also did a backstop for one of the Canadian G.I. Joe conventions, which was, for a time, and I think there was some controversy there. Oh, there we go. That backstop was actually acknowledged by Hasbro for a brief time as version 2 backstop, even though it was just hand-painted, custom using Serpentor of parts of all parts, and Steeler. Although the Serpentor at the time did come with a helmet very reminiscent of backstops. And so with a couple of extra parts, like the knife on his chest really sold the backstop silhouette, and the belt with the canister, or not the canister, the canteen, also just broke up the flow of the Serpentor look. And because then we also changed the colors so that it wasn't like gold from head to toe. It was black on top with the silver armor, and then brown on top, which is kind of like taking the backstop recipe and making a more realistic tones to the color choices. We went with black instead of green and brown instead of yellow, which just shows that the backstop design is a good design. It just was saddled with some really terrible colors. So let's take a few steps back. Oh, yeah.
That's the prototype with the green.
No, so the green gloves and belt and stuff, that was the permanent one. But we went with the black sleeves and black abs, as though he's got a black shirt underneath his armor.
This is the one that we put together when we were talking about it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
So
are you asking or are you telling me?
No, I'm saying that. This
okay.
is. I've pulled up all of the stuff, including all the prototypes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like, for instance, just quickly jump on that one, and then we'll get back into the continuity of what we were supposed to be talking about. But the backstop, of course, came with a vehicle.
Yeah.
And that vehicle was the Deadeye.
That's right. It was
paper there.
A mildly modified version, or slightly modified version of the Armadillo that had come out for the 25th anniversary line. And it had the sticker similar to what was on the Persuader, which just said Dead Eyes and had like angry eyes on the back of it. The vintage G.I. Joe vehicles often had details like that where it's not explained anywhere, and the designer just made a choice, and maybe it was reflective of an earlier version of the vehicle that never made it into the official lore. But yeah, it was cool because every kid had their opportunity to explain why this tank has Dead Eyes written on the back of it like that. So we used that as the homage for what we did with the personal version of the Persuader, the Dead Eyes.
And I have the prototype of that here,
mm-hmm.
which we were actually going to make it 2-color, more similar to the way that a Slaughter's Marauders vehicle looked.
I don't remember that part.
Yeah, well, Ed and I tried to do it, and then basically it kind of was way too labor intensive. It involved a RIT dye bath that had to be done at a certain angle and all that kind of stuff. And so we ended up with that idea just not going forward. It was Mike, was the owner of the convention, whose idea was to, I think, put the guns on the side at first.
Yeah.
We did a prototype of that, but we tried to do one where it was essentially you put it into a RIT dye bath, and then you put the other part on an angle on it, and then dyed it all together, and it had this really cool kind of angular. I don't know how well it's showing on the camera or not, and
I can see the break
to it. Absolutely cannot see it. So, but the idea is that the die left a 45-degree angle break on it where it was 2 different colors, and so it looked pretty cool. But it just trying to do 100 of those was it was just not on the cards, given how much work everything else was going to be as well.
Well, so similar backstop. The prototype has the same color arms as Ab Crunch, right?
Yeah. So the prototype had. Oops, no, that's not him. Prototype versus the reality. Boy, I have stuff right here. So the real one um, had, so put the two next to each other, take this
Yep.
bag, the bag. You notice that this one had a painted neck, um, whereas the other one didn't. And yeah, the legs were a different color to better. These ones were painted in the prototype, they were painted black. In this one, they were painted the orange,
Yeah.
which is a little bit more reminiscent of the actual figure.
So at one point between those two, it was decided that the arms would also be the same color as the legs because then it wouldn't require painting because the arms have the most joints and therefore most likely that, paint chips and whatnot. And also, if you're dyeing it, you have to keep changing the elbow so that you're getting every spot of it. And so again, we were thinking that's too labor intensive. So we'll just have arms the same color as his legs, even though on the vintage backstop his arms matched his, like, it was just a sweater, so it matched his stomach. And then I got these 100 backstop figures that I was then painting up. And after I'd painted up all of the chest, like I'd followed all the instructions, and I was just looking at it with these brown arms, and I was like, it is going to take me twice as long to do the arms as it's taken me to do everything else that I painted, but I can't leave the arms brown. And so I it gave
Every
myself
single
all
one.
kinds of extra work, but just for love of backstop and the perfectionist in me that has often come up when I'm working on the G.I. Joe RPG. Like there is a lot of stuff that I make harder on myself just because that's my work ethic. And so yeah, so I eventually did go in and repaint all of those. So it was 100 black arms, and then we had to contact Jason Liu, who had done the comic tie-in for the convention set, and it
Oh
was
my
like,
goodness.
how you've colored every single instance of backstop like the agreed upon color scheme. How much work would it be to go back in and recolor all of his arms? And luckily, Loop was, Loop as he was known on the boards. Jason Loop now working for Marvel and with like an incredible resume. So it is super cool that I got to say I worked on a comic with Jason Liu. And unfortunately gave Jason a whole bunch of extra work because he had to go in and also recolor all the arms to match the figure.
It feels very traditional of how Marvel would do this sort of thing. So I feel like that was a very legitimate experience about what it would be going forward for him. So that's good. And Jason was awesome. So.
And still is. Love Jason.
Mhm. So, do we want to go a little bit deeper into this, or is there something we wanted to talk about before we got
Yeah,
here?
let's take a few steps back. So the Canadian
Okay.
G.I. Joe conventions and meets. This is like there were not regional conventions like this as far as I know, but just one day on the message boards, it was posted that I wasn't in the mods section at this point, so I don't know the origins of how this came to be, but it was just decided there's going to be this meet where a bunch of Canadians are going to get together and just talk about GI Joe. And although Toronto is quite a drive away for me, I missed the first one, but then when just for through FOMO and through like the people talking about how well the first one went, I went to the second one and ended up going to all of them thereafter. So you were involved in an earlier stage than I was. So what's your take on how the GI Joe Canadian meets and then later conventions came to be?
Well, so you can't talk about the Canadian GI Joe meets and conventions or anything like that without talking about Bounty Hunter Toys and
Mm-hmm.
Bounty Hunter Mike, who was the proprietor of it. There were a couple of really key customers. Mike and I were friends, and he had this thing called the $2 bin, which was $2 GI Joes. You would go in, there's anything you couldn't complete or that had cracked elbows or anything like that, custom fodder was thrown into a bin. And then I would go and I'd pick out 10 figures every Wednesday and every Friday because those were the days that while I was commuting back from between where I lived and where I worked, went right past the place. And so I'd go in, I'd talk to him for half an hour and we'd, catch up and I'd come away with a couple more Joes. That is, I think, probably went for every 2 times a week for every 10 Joes, 2 times a week for about 2.5 years. But you also met a couple of other people, Pete, who goes by Pete the Greek online. He went there, and Ed, who I would then end up working with and collaborated with, he goes by Stealth Viper. They all of us kind of got together and said, okay, well, the U.S. has a big convention, we should have one too. And Mike had some really good significant ambition and had that salesmanship to be able to market these things. But the first one only had 4 people come to it. We went to Krabby Joe's, which was funny, and we brought like tourist figures. I think figures with regular like Cobra Commander, but wearing a Chuckles shirt and all that kind of stuff, and took pictures. But really, it wasn't really that much of anything. Then the next year, it became considerably different, and the thing that sort of changed it was the Joe Canuck figure, and that's this guy. So the head here was custom. Every one of them was custom made by Jason Loop, as they are Loop custom heads, and he made all of them by hand, and it was a pretty impressive undertaking. We were talking about anti-builders, so there were these peg warming winter figures at the time, and they were everywhere that you could see them. You could find for maybe $2, $3. The Big Ben and Snow Job.
Whiteout.
No, Whiteout. Yeah, sorry. But that particular two pack was probably the least successful thing that has one of the least successful things Hasbro has ever released. So we bought all of them everywhere. A, to get them off the pegs, but also because we wanted to create these custom figures. And so the Joe Canuck with a custom file card, and that started to really garner a little bit of buzz. And so we met in a bowling alley, sorry, under a bowling alley, across from Bounty Hunter Toys at the time. And it was fairly big. It was starting to get like we had four, and then all of a sudden we had 20. And the one that came after that was really, I think, the breakout year, which was the Black Ice year. And that one was I had been anti-building a whole bunch of Mirages. The Mirage mold had been there forever. It was released on so many different things and with so many interesting characters. It was everyone had kind of grown out of the character. It became a dull character because it had just been released so many times.
Well, he also came with the Viper, which
Yeah,
was the base army builder for, like, at the time, army building was still novel, and then Hasbro put out this new pack with Mirage and the Viper, and people just bought every Viper they could, and we had, the community at large had thousands of Mirages that they didn't know what to do with.
which is an opportunity.
Hmm.
So when we put them together, I have, I think, the real one and the yeah. So this was the prototype one that I put together at Mike's request. Uh, there were cast parts, and I was working with a bunch of cast parts people for both this project and other projects. And so I had a couple of samples that had been sent to me for a different project, and I said, okay, well, you know what? This stuff is really done at a very high level of quality, and I think we can probably find something that will fit. Find a head or something that will fit in there, and we couldn't actually end up finding a head that would fit in the chest because it's a very unique chest on the and neck hole on the
Megmarines.
robot figure. So we ended up going with two fairly difficult to find pieces, which belonged to, I think, Sludge Viper, and the chest
Vapor, right?
was Vapor. Yeah, I think that's what it was. So yeah, unfortunately, this was many, many years ago, and I forget a lot of the names pieces, but this was the original one that we came up with, and we knew that we had something good here. Mike named it Black Ice, and in order to be able to manage the painting load, and this is what the final figure ended up looking like,
Hmm.
it just had two very simple pieces, and then everything else was writ dyed, but maintained its sort of silvery view, which gave it a lot of that. It just had so amazingly much character,
Hmm.
and nobody didn't like it. And there were always differing opinions on everything at the time. This guy was absolutely like unambiguously loved, and that brought a lot of people in. And Mike was really good at figuring out how to use that sort of buzz into marketing. It really, and there were a couple of years after that. I wasn't involved in the actual creation of the characters after that. I only got back in around 2009. But it was one of those things where the figures kind of fueled the interest, and then the interest fueled the marketing, and then the marketing got the people there. And so it had really grown, and it is an enormous credit to Mike, like his marketing skill and his understanding of how all of this stuff works, that he was able to just bring people in and grow it out of a small thing. It would only last a couple more years because it hit that kind of ramp thing where every year was so much bigger than the previous one. By the time we were in 2009, we were looking at convention centers. We were working with Larry Hama. We had Larry Hama there. All of that ramp made it, I think, a little difficult to sustain without a staff and a bunch of dedicated people working on it. So it might have collapsed a little under its own weight, but it was for a while. The buzz was much higher than even the for the actual GI Joe convention.
Yeah,
And
the greatest thing. So Black Ice was universally loved, and then the other universally loved thing that we put out was the Hate Tank, which was a chromed hiss tank. But the like you were saying, Mike's marketing genius. He realized that around that time, people were going to like Chinese, Chinese eBay and things like that to see what people were basically stealing from the factory and selling online, and these would then tell us what was coming later for the GI Joe. So basically, before it was going out in press releases and whatever, the people in the know knew how to get the information from these Chinese websites. And so Mike took a picture of that his tank, which he took a his tank, which was actually fairly easy to come by at the time because of the 25th anniversary. He sent it to like a trophy manufacturer and had them just coat it in chrome, and it looked perfect. It retained its details. It is amazing that he pulled that off. And so then he sent just a picture of a dozen of them or so to some connection he had in China to put it up on a website, not to sell or anything. No real information, just like, here is a silver hiss tank, and people lost their minds, and they were like, this must be the American official convention is putting this out in the next convention set. That is so good. And unfortunately for them, their next convention set was just taking one of their convention sets they'd already done and doing it in a new style. And so no one was excited about that, and everyone was so confused about where this silver hiss was coming from. And so then we finally said, like, oh, no, it is part of the Canadian GI Joe convention. You know, the Black Ice guys, the Joe Canuck guys? Well, now they are the Silver Hiss Tank guys. And he came up with the idea of the hate, which the H, it's an acronym, and it's a clever acronym, and it looks amazing. And by then, Loop was doing like a monthly comic of just people in this Canadian GI Joe universe that we were building. And, one of the reasons we got all these Hiss Tanks was because we connected with Hasbro and said, like, we'll make a charitable donation if you give us access to all of these leftover pieces that you have.
Well, that was that was the other part of the story that I'll tell is that Ed and I had an idea. So Mike had arranged with Hasbro, and the goal was to get the Hiss tanks. He arranged for it. He purchased those from them. They came packed with the Serpentor Air Chariot and Armadillo pack. It was a shelf warmer. It was not doing well, so they said just throw them out. And I looked at Ed, and Ed looked at me, and I'm like, that doesn't sound right. We can do something with that. So we actually wrote a business case to Hasbro, indicating that this was kind of a loss of X number of dollars of product. What we propose is that we absorb that product into what it is that we're delivering. We would deliver this product against this, and we would deliver this, this amount of money to Hasbro charities in order to be able to use the other half of those boxes and not just throw it out. Because I just, at the time, I couldn't even imagine throwing out brand new GI Joe product without at least doing something with it. So that we got permission from Hasbro. They approved the business case. It was quite literally a written business case. And I think they were very impressed with the professionalism with which we approached it, and with the fact that we came forward with a plan and came forward with projections. That was Ed and I at the time. That's sort of where we were in our professional careers. So we ended up having this stuff that we could play with. And then it was around messing around with it, going, okay, we have this box. These are all the pieces that we have. What can we do with it? And part of that, Chacal Noir, or was
Black Jackal. Chacal
Black
Noir.
Jackal, was the one that I designed that one because that was the pieces that we had. So I'm not sure that I can totally take credit for designing it. It was the best of how we could fit things in. Flipped web gear around, put the Cementor bald head on the Steeler body, and dyed it black. And that was a really well done figure. But then I got to work with Larry Hama. Mike set it up, Mike made the connection, and got to talk about, this is what the character looked like, this is the thing, and it had a Larry Helm file card. And Mike was good at getting Larry to write things. Larry is very good at writing things if you give him money for doing that. And we ended up with this thing, which it was really just bigger than the sum of its parts. His tanks were impressive, but they weren't really selling that well because there was a lot of ways to get them. And that Air Chariot versus Armadillo one was it wasn't really that successful. But we created out of it what turns out to be one of the most expensive things that you can purchase online now. It is such a rare, incredible figure. I've seen Black Ice figures go for $800.
Oh wow! I've seen them go for 5. I didn't know they reached 8.
They've leveled out at about between $400 and $500. This set, incomplete, complete, the set I've seen go for. I saw it sell for 1,500, but I've seen them listed for over 2,000.
Nice.
And it's crazy when we see these things, and we had a hand in making them. And I'm like looking at these black ices, and I'm going, every one of those came out of my customizing scrap pile, right? Because every one of those bodies were ones that I collected for some custom project some point in the future. And it's almost humbling to see that, your work valued at such a massive amount. A lot of that, of course, has to do with Mike's marketing prowess, but and when it comes down to it, it was a really interesting thing to be involved in, and it got such press, and it was so important to the community at the time. And so those are some of the happiest memories I take out of that period, even of that period of my life, was being able to work on those things and create these wonderful toys that people really enjoyed.
So I just want to then we'll go back to Backstop because that's the one piece that was left over from the set. We've talked about a lot of it, but how it came to be is that you came up with that Steeler part, and then you were like, "This is Serpentor. He's way too specific. There's nothing we can do with these parts." That's when I was looking at it. It's like that helmet is so reminiscent of Backstop, and if we use that clearly armor torso, we could kind of approximate a Backstop figure and use the Steeler head that you've taken off. Like somehow that kind of works for Backstop, but here's the problem. All of our characters up until now have been original characters to our G.I. Joe conventions. Yes, they're in the Hasbro G.I. Joe world, and yes, they use the Hasbro, like the official Cobra logo and whatnot, which is where we're really like, that's where we were pushing it, but we somehow still got away with it. But to actually say, here is a character created by Hasbro, owned by Hasbro, and reusing him, that's like a step too far, right? And Mike's like, we are literally talking to Hasbro regularly for the set. Let's just ask if it's okay. And they said, like, can we use this obscure Canadian character and officially call this a Backstop toy? And this was before the hiss really had caught on, the hate rather. And so they were like, sure, whatever. It's Backstop. Nobody cares about it but you lot. Fine. And then the hate caught on. And then the Collectors Club got upset because they had contracts and whatnot that they were the only people that could officially be putting out these officially recognized Hasbro affiliated toys. And so we were too successful, and all of our just like handshake deals and whatnot now were not enough. And so for that little while, that Hasbro and all of these characters were officially acknowledged on like Yojo and stuff, even though they were handmade customs. They were just handmade in such a large enough quantity and were acknowledged by Hasbro Canada, a subsidiary of Hasbro, that they were officially recognized as parts of the G.I. Joe line. And then that was rescinded when it was realized that's too much legal paperwork that was not signed for us to have that official status. But it's still cool that for a split second, we were part of the Hasbro universe.
Mm-hmm. And in the minds of collectors, in the minds of a lot of people, that never got rescinded. I mean, when it came down to it, Canada owned Backstop, and that's how you got one. And that was the way that it was. And it was a cool figure. I mean, given its humble origins, it's what do we do with this scrap that's left over? and then it becoming something that was like it had a controversy about it, but it has a really cool story about it as well. And
Hmm.
it ended up being a fairly cool figure for where what we had to do and where it was. And of course, it drove the what it was that the Deadeye was going to be, and drove ended up driving kind of the theme of that part of the set. They were originally going to be two different sets, and they got put into one because packaging made a lot more sense if you put them into one, and it could raise the total price of what it was that we could ask for it. But yeah, it was really just an incredibly interesting period because we were in this strange legal, quasi-legal, like small but then large and blew up online and all of that kind of stuff that was there. It made it a really exciting time to be a part of it. And you're always kind of on the edge of your seats. They're going to let us do it. They're not going to let us do it. What's going to go on? Yeah, but it was a blast. That was really amazing. I think the one after that was the last one.
Were there
But
one or two after that? No, there were. No, you're right. There was only one after that. Yeah, the one after that had a cool comic I wrote. Loop did the interior art, but Robert Atkins did the cover, and it was a really cool
wow,
cover. And it had a new because like the body types had changed over the time, and so it had a new sculpt version of Joe Canuck and Black Ice, which was kind of cool. And then just a lot of extra characters that never really caught on and were not quite up to our full standards. And so I think between G.I. Joe Online fandom kind of puttering out and this one not hitting huge and also retreading previous ground, even though like the retreads were probably the highlight of the set. Yeah, so that ended up being our last one. And plus, it was the same team of people that actually we shrunk because you weren't involved in that last one. And so the people that were working on it were just putting too much effort into this one thing that, while it got us a lot of clout online, was taking away from our home lives and whatnot. And so, yeah, that ended up being the last con set. And there's talk about bringing it back. I know Mike fondly remembers those times, obviously. But there's no set plans of what we would do with a new, like a 2025 or 2026 Canadian G.I. Joe convention.
well, and I mean, I was probably had more fun than anyone in an unpaid internship has ever had. But at the end of it, when you get to a certain level of complexity, you kind of have to. You can't just do it with volunteers. You can't just do it as a one-off type piece like it had been done in the past. So it'd be very interesting to see if it was brought back now that I think the Canadian, sorry, the American one is gone, is it not? Is that
It's been
collected?
gone for a while now, yeah.
Yeah.
At least
So,
4 years.
so maybe it's right for a right time for them to bring back something. And Mike has certainly proven to be adept at marketing these sort of things. So it would be very good. I don't know if I would necessarily get involved in that end of it anymore. I've done a lot of work we're in like the golden age of hobbyists becoming professional manufacturers.
Yeah.
There are a couple of different lines right now which are really, really professionally produced product that is indistinguishable from what you would buy off a shelf, and sometimes they're crossing over into shelves.
Hmm.
And a lot of the people who are working on them are ones that we know well from our days in customization. They always wanted to do this. They always wanted to do this on a bigger scale, and now they're doing it. I've done a lot of writing for groups like that, sometimes compensated, sometimes promised to be compensated, not compensated, and sometimes not compensated. I figure for every dollar that I was promised, I've made one out of five. And so it gets to the point where it's very hard to try and sustain these things as not a volunteer and not as kind of they're run like a business, but they're dependent on people's joy in order to be able to do the work. And when people kind of lose the joy of it, becomes more business than it is joy, then they don't tend to be able to survive. They're not the strongest business model because it's very niche. I mean, people who want to buy a very amazing toy, but it's a figure like this and it's $30 and it doesn't really have kind of a whole marketing push behind it. It's tough kind of sometimes to make that case for people to really have them as passion projects. But then the cost of an action figure has skyrocketed so high. I'm just looking at the shelf behind you right now. various different classified figures, and
Yeah.
we'll certainly get to those later as well. But the amount of money that is being spent on toys now, it's almost unimaginable to me. And so there are a lot of options. I think that opens up to different people to be able to produce product out there that they wouldn't have otherwise. There's 3D printing. There's direct connections to China for mass production. Like all of what it is now is stuff that we could not possibly have dreamed of when we were, trying to figure out how to build something without using any corpse parts, which was the big standard in Bivouac, was that you weren't allowed to use any of the Leonard figures pieces because that was considered low class. From there to where we ended up, which is professional manufacturing on a somewhat large scale, it's an amazing ride. Like it was amazing 20-year period of just innovation and moving ahead with technology and moving ahead with communications and small scale marketing and all of that kind of stuff. It was a microcosm of what was happening on with the rest of the world, and we did it. And it was just an amazing time to be part of.
Oh boy, we are pushing an hour on an episode that was supposed to be 30 minutes. No, there we go. We just passed the 1 hour mark. But I do want to cover the last couple of topics we talked about. One of them was, this is a lightning round. Let's see if we can actually keep it short. Just talk
Okay.
about some of the things that have come out in G.I. Joe over the time period that we've just been discussing. And just get your takes on them just to see how people who know what's been going on with G.I. Joe get an idea of where you stand in some of those. So I'm talking about G.I. Joe from 1997 to 2025, so to today. So 1997 to 2002, we got the Real American Hero collection, which was a lot of repaints of the vintage figures. They were sold in 2 packs for the most part, and new color schemes for familiar vehicles. And in that same time period, we got the Devil's Due comics, which was the first time somebody had made G.I. Joe comics since Hasbro's run with Marvel ended. Which, yeah, thinking back now, was only 3 years after the finale of the Marvel run, and yet at the time, it felt like such a dirge of product that we had just been abandoned because G.I. Joe Extreme had come out, and then Sergeant Savage. Nope, I got those backwards. Sergeant Savage, then G.I. Joe Extreme, and then we got these Real American Hero Collection repaints. So, what are some of your hot takes and memories of this time period?
So some things were really successful, some things weren't. Devil's Due changed the way that GI Joe would be looked at forever. Definitely had a different the art styles, the shaping, all of the different and the shape of the figures that they were starting to come out. That actually no, that's more 2002. But the idea was they were taking some risks with them because they were low production values. So you had like these paint wiped, strange figures, really mixed reaction to those ones. And then the Devil's Due comics, again, very mixed reaction to that because the art styles and the storytelling styles were so different. It was a real period of transition. But as any change, people didn't like it at the beginning, and then people loved it as soon as the next change came along and said, "Why can't it be more like?" Because so I think that was definitely a very interesting period of time. Those years, some interesting product came out. Some of it's very desirable, some of it isn't. Devil's Due comics, some of them were fantastic, some of them weren't. But what came next was a entirely new, entirely different push. And I think that a lot of the 2002 took a lot of people out and brought a lot of new people in. And so there are some people who will only collect up to 2002 because that was the period of their GI Joe.
I also want to talk about Devil's Due comics briefly in that the first issue came out on September 12th, 2001, the day after 9/11, and suddenly we had this rah-rah Real American Hero comic came out, and it was a huge seller, probably just because, like, I have a feeling that 9/11 literally fueled this G.I. Joe Renaissance, but that was also the first of the 80s brands being adapted into comics, which then got to Transformers and, in a lot of ways, pushed everything we're seeing of the 80s revival. It is weird to say, but in a lot of ways, 9/11 fueled the 80s revival thanks to the completely coincidental timing of this Devil's Due issue #1 coming out.
Oof.
It's It is a very direct line. I'm not just being a conspiracy theorist here.
No, no, I mean, it's very interesting that the reason why we care about GI Joe at all was based on government deregulation of
Yeah.
the advertising sector, and the reason why it brought it back was, well, a rather large terrorist act. So it's very interesting to tie the timeline of this toy to the timeline of to the politics of the time. And it's not always the most wonderful stories that are saying it, but of course, we took the most wonderful of memories out of it. So.
Well, and I do think one of the reasons that G.I. Joe was so like that it lasted beyond the politics of its era and the like very basic rah rah go USA because we're a couple of Canadian guys that fell in love with G.I. Joe, and a lot of it is what I was talking about earlier with Larry Hama, where he would add an extra layer and often a layer that went against the politics at the time that just added depth to the universe and made this more than just what it appeared to be.
Mhm.
All right, 2002 through 2004 is what's, at least at the time, was called the New Sculpt era. This is where we went G.I. Joe versus Cobra, to Spy Troops, to Valor versus Venom, where just every year they would throw a new gimmick in there, but generally there was this new body construction that lasted throughout the 3 years that we're talking about there, where it was still 4 inch and for the most part still had an O-ring, but they were larger. They weren't G.I. Joe Extreme large, but you could see influences from that era and how like combining a little bit of the buffer aesthetic with more consistent proportions carried through to that era of G.I. Joe.
It was terrible. There were literally like people were putting things on websites and in their email signatures with O-ring MIA on them, which I really only understand how problematic that is now. But at the time, it was a very big deal that they were having these T-crotched or essentially losing that waist flexibility on the figures. End to line was like the big thing about it, about how people would always kind of overreact to them. They were interesting. They were visually interesting. They were nothing like the products that came before them. And so I think for a lot of people, 2002 represents a big break in the continuity of what the figures are like. But on the other hand, in those period of times, they produced more different figures, including all the repaints, than they had previously. All the other figures combined from all the other previous lines combined. So there are a lot of people who are going to grow up and that will have been their GI Joe. And that will, and it had excellent storylines. They were very kid focused. It had really interesting support in cartoons and things like that. So it was a big deal. It was a very big time for GI Joe and rebranding and rebuilding. And yeah, I didn't like it, but I still have a lot of the figures from it, and there were some really excellent ones that came through it. Not all of them, but certainly a lot of them.
Yeah, it was definitely like so. That was the time where it felt like they would occasionally throw the collectors the bone. We had the Devil's Due comics, which were more collector focused. They were not touching on the G.I. Joe versus Cobra storyline that was being presented in the toys, except the occasional time a new characters designed from those toys would show up, and we would get the occasional collector set of like a 6 pack or a 5 pack. Here's Tiger Force. Here's Python Patrol. Here's just a bunch of Vipers, and those were the ones that like they were made out of the construction from the 80s and 90s, and they were also more reminiscent of the designs from those eras. Whereas those 3 years, they completely broke away. Like Duke never looked like any of the Dukes that did come before. It was always here's a new Duke every year, and everyone has a new design. Really, the only two characters that had, or three characters, I guess, that had callback designs were Cobra Commander, Snake Eyes, and Storm Shadow. And actually, this era was very good for Snake Eyes' visor, which is something that was remembered as like that's the iconic Snake Eyes, even though only one of his 6 figures from the 80s and 90s had that look. This was the first time that they were like, this is what people think Snake Eyes should look like, so let's make Snake Eyes look like this. And similar with Cobra Commander and the hood and the mask, they were pretty consistent with what those characters looked like through this era.
And yeah, you go back to the 5 packs. That was actually a really a big time. I had income and not a whole lot of expenses at that point, and so I bought about 200 of the Vipers in those various different 5 packs because I wanted to have a big army like all the rich people did from, that were previously online. These were amazing figures. They're actually kind of crap. Every one of them had to be fixed. Otherwise, they would, if you turn them upwards, they would break their crotches. So
Yeah.
of all 200 figures, I went in with an X-Acto knife and scraped off the bit that you needed to in order to be able to make them work. But it was there was a time where I was like, I don't know how I could spend $20 better and make myself happier than buying another one of these packs. So for collectors, and it was at that point there was peak internet of people being able to show off their giant collections. It was the right product at the right time for us, and made a lot of people very happy. And I think that maybe I forget about that period because of the garishness of giant-shouldered Scarlet and like all of those sort of weird one-off figures certainly stole the press. But yeah, there was some really good stuff for collectors in there as well.
And I've also thrown in here in 2004, Hasbro, or sorry, Wizards of the Coast released G.I. Joe the trading card game. This was a game that only lasted a couple of waves, has no historical significance when it comes to trading card games as a whole. But to G.I. Joe fans, we rarely got something like this, and so to be able to go into a game store, see G.I. Joe ads up there, and to be able to buy these cards was a thrill. And it was such an odd selection of characters and concepts in there because it was a mix of the toys that were out at the time and vintage stuff. Like, it was just the idea of G.I. Joe evergreen designs started to show up here, where you could get a Snake Eyes looking nothing like the one you're used to, next to Ripcord, who had not had an action figure since the 80s at that time, in his vintage look. The game was okay. It played fine. I always remember it because Tina and I, my wife now, played, like, we would just set up games and play 50 rounds in a row some night while drinking some chai tea. And we also brought it to the Canadian G.I. Joe convention at the time, because there was one year where the exclusive was not an action figure, but it was a card for the trading card game of
Oh
Joe
yeah.
Canuck. And we had a tournament, and I lost in the first round, but Tina won the whole tournament, which you gave her Tank Girl nickname because she had used a tank-heavy deck.
I remember that now.
Yeah. I have fond memories of this game, and there was a third wave that was announced, and a release date was scheduled, which means that those cards must have existed somewhere, and they never got released. And I would have loved like an uncut sheet of what those cards would have looked like. That's probably one of my biggest and most me specific holy grails of the G.I. Joe fandom. And it's 11 years ago now that deck trading card game came out. So the odds that it exists anywhere is basically none right now. But man, I would have loved to have just seen it. Like, are there digital files anywhere? Like, what was the third wave of that game going to look like?
All right, well, internet, go forth and find. I'm going to do a quick little vignette about
Ooh.
GI Joe trading card games. So first, one of the first games I designed was a that actually went anywhere. I knew a guy from Hasbro, and he was going to go and take it and pitch it to Hasbro, and it was based on cards. It had a I won't go into the mechanics. It sucked. I know that now, having all of the other things to compare it to, but we're going to do a pitch for it. And right before the pitch, they said, okay, they've canceled the pitch. Why they cancel the pitch? They're going a whole new direction with G.I. Joe, and it's awesome. I'm like, okay, what is it? And they basically went on to describe to me Captain America. And of course, that turned into Sergeant Savage. And I'm like, that's Captain America. And it's like, yeah, and everything's, and I'm like, there are no kids who care about World War II anymore. Like, there've been several wars in between that they will care about more than World War II, and they've already read Captain America. And so, yeah, I kind of burned my bridges with that particular rep. But and I just recently threw out the prototype for that because I'm like,
Oh.
this isn't going anywhere. This is, I have to let go of the nostalgia around it. But it was the first prototype that I'd ever created, and it was the first time that I'd had a set up with an actual manufacturer. And then there was just this change of direction at the last minute. And I'm like, oh,
Mm.
and yeah, so I would handle that entirely different. Actually, I wouldn't have pitched that product based on how bad it was. But it's just one of those things where G.I. Joe and trading card games has always flirted with each other. And yeah, it was certainly one. I enjoyed the game, but it was definitely one of those ones where if you were playing against a Ryan or a Tina, you get annihilated because there were some really good cards that you could play. So yeah, no, I don't know, it was a very good time. And I'd forgotten about the card. I probably have that somewhere in one of my sets.
I would hope so. Now that you mentioned, I don't know why I didn't start this at 1995, where we could just briefly talk about Sergeant Savage and G.I. Joe Extreme, but we've brought them both up since then, so hopefully our thoughts are clear. 2005, Sigma 6 came out. So this was another era of Death of Taline, where people were like, no, this is just jumping on anime trends and whatnot. And the characters just looks like Centurions, all of which is true. I still love Sigma 6. Sigma 6 was the first time I really felt like G.I. Joe tried to reimagine itself. And so the New Sculpt era just felt like inferior to what I grew up on. It was trying to recapture it, but it just was not as good. Whereas Sigma 6 felt different. And there's a reason that I have virtually no items from the New Sculpt era other than accessories, because the accessories were still in line with what we grew up on. But I have 2 full shelves of Sigma 6 stuff because it's interesting and it's different. And so when you stand it next to G.I. Joe, you could say, like, that is clearly Snake Eyes, but it's not a Snake Eyes like I've seen before. And it had an animated series on television, unlike the New Sculpt era where you had to buy the DVDs. I love the construction. I love everything about Sigma 6. And I think it was the break from what G.I. Joe had been doing for the last 20 years that G.I. Joe needed before moving on to the next thing. What's your take on Sigma 6?
My take on Sigma 6 was highly influenced by your enthusiasm for Sigma 6. You are definitely, I went in kind of neutral about it. I've always been a scale collection person, so I'd be more interested in purchasing a Star Wars figure in the same scale that would work with my Joes than something that's
Keep talking, I'm just getting some off the shelf.
It's something that has followed me into classified, which we'll talk about as well. But basically, I really, really like the size factor of a 3 3/4 inch figure because it was big enough to play with, but small enough to put on a shelf. And I couldn't get into something really much larger. On the other hand, the cartoons I loved. I absolutely loved Tunnel Rat from the Sigma 6 line. Like I really enjoyed that recharacterization, and I think it primed me for all of the recharacterizations to come with to have an open mind for them because it was really a really enjoyable show to watch. For its era, it was right in sync with what the other cartoons were, but with a GI Joe spin on it. So I really liked it, even if I didn't collect much of it. I did not, however, like when they went down to 2.5.
Okay, let's talk about the 2.5-inch line for a minute. So Sigma 6 was an 8-inch, it's an 8-inch line like we were talking about, and that meant very few vehicles. There's a couple of motorcycles, this parachute pack and whatnot. Like, that was as big as they could get. I think they should have released a Trouble Bubble, a vehicle that you do not have fond memories of, which is one of the My Friend Charles stories that I've brought up on the podcast in the past. But it would have been a good scale for what they were doing. So to get vehicles into the line, they created a separate line, which is 2.5 inches, which is about half the size of the 4-inch or the 3.75 inches that we collected, which was super frustrating because it's like, if you're going to make a smaller G.I. Joe, why not? Why are you doing this like big mask figure instead of just going with a G.I. Joe action figure? And then the designs for the vehicles were pretty cool. There's a lot of really cool concepts that we only ever saw in that scale right there. But the figures were useless. They were pre-posed. Often they had a base built into their foot, and they couldn't fit in the vehicles. So if this was a vehicle line, why are you making figures for it that are useless with the vehicles? It made absolutely no sense.
And it was just so close enough, though, that you could
so close
and squeeze somebody in. The one that I do still have that's remaining in my collection is that big double rotor helicopter thing from
Dragonhawk.
Yeah, Dragonhawk, the thing that they knocked off from Aliens because that and one that would come in a future line. They really liked the Aliens looking things. Everyone did. So they created these things. It's an amazing looking vehicle. It has an excellent action thing. And if it was like just a little bit wider, it would be an amazing toy. And I've kept it as such. You can put Star Wars figures into it. There's the really small ones that'll fit into it. But it proves how good it could have been if it was just a little bit bigger. And it would have worked really well, but some of it, yeah. Like
there's the Mantis mech, which I've squeezed a Rock Viper, so a Range Viper repaint into the cockpit. So he's supposed to be standing on this platform, but I've got him sort of hovering over it like it's a seat. I don't know how well you can see any of that. But anyway, like all of these arms are interchangeable with the other mechs they had. This cannon on the top pops off and becomes a turret. Like there's so much interplay between all the pieces that it was, again, super exciting. Could have been great, but because the figures were useless and because we had to deal with a different scale, yet again for G.I. Joe, one that was not necessary, just so close. But one thing I want to point out about Sigma 6, and I know this is supposed to be your segment, but I'm talking about like the play factor is so cool. So they had all these little things like here he had a communicator pop up on his wrist, and the accessories could mostly plug into these ports, although not enough. Like that was another one of those things. Like, why are you covering them in these ports and then not releasing releasing accessories that don't fit in them? But here he had a backpack that you press this button, these wings pop out, his sword's sheathed into the backpack. And the reason I specifically chose this figure is because like 2 3 years ago, I discovered he's got blades that telescope into his wings, which is not mentioned on the instructions. And I only discovered because he fell off the shelf. And when I was picking him up, I was like, what is that? And I pulled it out, and it's like, he's got these collapsible wings there. And I reached out to our friend Justin Bell, who was also, he's the other really big Sigma 6 guy I know. And I'm like, did you know about this? And he's like, I don't think I did know about that. And then in a Sigma 6 group I'm in online, someone was like, hey, look what I found. And I was like, yeah, fool around with the wings and see what pops out. So they had hidden toy features. Like there is still stuff I don't know if I know about. Like the clips were removable from a lot of the guns, and that's not advertised. Like there's still features to discover in this, again, 10-year-old long dead toy line.
But it was a gem of a line, and I think
Yeah.
it was one of the most unique things that they've done. Like even the original figures were a riff on Star Wars figures, but these they felt entirely different than anything else that was on the shelf. And of course, new and different is immediately hated on and put it off the shelves. So it didn't last very long, but I think that people are going to really enjoy those toys when they get to vintage if they have survived, because unfortunately they did play Warrior really did because of all the joints and different pieces. If any part of it became floppy, it essentially stopped being a really good toy to play with. So that's really the downside. But the good news is that so few people did play with them. The ones that you're going to find are probably going to be in good shape and be able to still be played with.
Yeah, I have a couple of Minton box ones, and one of the things they did with the first line is that they had a red light in the package that was flashing Morse code, and those have all died, and now that means that all these Minton card packages have dead batteries in them, which is bad, and it can erode, it can ruin the toy in the package. So maybe at some point I got to take them out of the package, but it is cool that I was still able, 5 years later, to find these Minton card and able to preserve that aspect of it. Because the packaging was cool too. Packaging, the top and the bottom of the package was a footlocker that once you undid the package, you put it together and you could put all of their accessories into the footlocker. There is so much clever design to this line.
We weren't going to geek out too much on any one given thing, though. I didn't realize I'd be the person talking about time frames, but yeah.
Yeah, sorry. All right.
No, and this is tremendous. You can actually just cut this into 2 episodes because there's so much good stuff in here. And this is really, I mean, what you're going to see here is this is what we loved. Right.
Yeah.
This is, and I'm not saying it's the basis of our friendship, which I think is a lot of mutual respect for talent and skill, but it's also the thing that brought us together and so many other people. Like I have so many friends in the States that I would not have were it not for this line and for this community and for everything else we're being. And so when you're hearing this and you're hearing the enthusiasm that you have, it brings me right back into this is the shared joy that brought us all together.
Yeah. Well, when we met, we were in love with a toy line that had stopped like 3 4 years ago, and our fondest memories were 10 years ago. So now we're talking about what is 10 years from now, and we have a shared experience there, which is really cool.
Let's see. Oh,
I have the direct to customer era on the outline. Do you have any strong feelings about that? Do we even summarize it?
believe it or not, I loved a lot of it. There
Okay.
was there were two really great figures that half of them were fantastic, and so there's that you could purchase really cheaply at the time, and they had a lot of really good head sculpts, and those could be cut down and essentially put in other figures. They had great detail. They were wonderful looking. And there were certain figures in the line that were ridiculously proportioned, but if you took the well-proportioned bottom of this and the well-proportioned top of that, you create some really amazing looking figures. And because they were such a failure and they were so cheap, they're overlooked. So things like their Range Viper and the one that looks like wears owl glasses and looks like a rat and has a tail.
Oh, Swamp Rat?
Swamp Rat. Those were great figures. And if you take all the stuff away and look at them as figures, they were a wonderful basis for creating those. I created a couple of large scale custom armies associated with those figures. And one of them I still have, two of them are gone. But where they're phenomenal toys. So I took a lot more out of DTC than I think a lot of people did, but there was some really interesting stuff. And of course, there's the Rhino,
Yeah,
which was the APC from
aliens.
Aliens.
Yep.
But when you pressed a button, a helicopter popped out. So like full highwayman, the helicopter integrated into the thing, and then the helicopter pops out there. Love that toy. Absolutely love that toy. One of the few that I've kept mint in box and had and played with because it's one of my favorite things to come out of that era.
All right. So then moving on to this was really one of G.I. Joe's biggest comebacks, and it was the 25th anniversary era. So unlike the new sculpt era where they were still coming up with new designs for everything with every action figure, 25th anniversary was just a celebration of what had come before, and it was here's a new body construction, but the old characters, the old designs, everything familiar, but with new, better articulation, which was unheard of at the time because G.I. Joe was known as the articulation line. And yeah, so it started off with these two 5 packs of some core members of both teams, and was very successful very early on, and it led to several years of just releasing a large portion of those original characters from the 12 years of the original line.
What I will throw onto that, because this has been explored endlessly, but this was the era where Hasbro became web savvy.
Mm,
This was the era of we released it, and this was the garbage version, and then we released the better one that everyone was asking for corrections to. That, oh, the hands are too small. Oh, he's not wearing gloves. Oh, he's not. Those sort of things kept coming up, and they listened, and then they re-released them, and basically met that need that was identified by the internet. So they were able to sell two, three, four of the same figure with minor tweaks that represented the tweaks that people wanted to see.
hmm
And then you had the creation of a whole bunch of figures that the acknowledgement of international figures, which has always been a very, very like niche thing. They would name them the standard characters, but Ninja Ku, which was released as a type of Storm Shadow, full black figure, gold trim, that was released or released on a card. So there was an acknowledgement of all of the areas of GI Joe in there, and more importantly, they were listening to and acting on the feedback that they were getting online. So I think that you're going to see that was how classified is really starting to shape up, is that it's web informed. They're using the data that they're collecting, they're listening to the collectors, and they're making changes to what it is they're releasing in order to be able to address that. And that I think was a tipping point for Hasbro. I think that became a lot of how they now look at building new product.
I also remember when G.I. Joe versus Cobra first launched, they updated their website, and so it had clips of the characters that were being sold, and none of the toys looked like the characters in the clips. Like they had the Neo Viper, which was the new basic Cobra Viper, and the clip was the Cobra Infantry Viper from 1986, and they do not look like the same thing at all. Whereas by making the designs based on the vintage characters, they were able to do cartoon inspired packs, comic inspired packs. Like they were able to say, this is what they look like. And look, we're not currently publishing a comic based on this stuff, but we've got this well of tie-in merchandise that we can now call on for our advertising and for special products and whatnot.
One thing I will add onto this as well, because I hate to burn time on it, but if you look at the difference between 2009 and 2004, the difference in what you could accomplish with tooling
Mm,
and the products that you could do. So essentially, it was the move from the last hand created or low tech created ones to higher CAD camming, better skills pieces that all really well fit together. You'll find that the arm joints could be smaller, the knee articulation could be better, and still all fit together. All of
mhm.
those things just demonstrated a significant sophistication that they weren't able to achieve in like 2003. By 2009, they were very, very good at doing it and making it like creating the lines that worked and creating proportions which were attractive to the eye.
Yeah, and they were able to camouflage the joints. Like you didn't have the metal rivets like we grew up on. and the screw showing up in the back, and they were able to create the same articulation as an O-ring without needing an O-ring. It was just all plastic and part of the construction of the figure. There were definitely some advances to the point that for a while, after the 25th came out, all other toy lines started to create toys very similar to that. Like Marvel had a whole line of toys that was basically the 25th anniversary articulation, but on Marvel toys.
And once that tech existed and was out of the box, I mean, Marvel had access to it, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
because Hasbro had access to it, and Hasbro used it on all sorts of different pieces. You'll find actually that there's more carryover in this line, and it's starting at the DTC era, they started carrying pieces between lines. And you see more crossover between those pieces because once that tooling existed and once they had the mechanisms to create that, that's how you want to create toys because it creates great toys. Toys that look good. Now, they look better on a shelf usually and then in your hand and playing, but they do look like really great toys, and that's what sells them, particularly at adult collectors.
I'm also curious how many people that were working on this line grew up on G.I. Joe, whereas in the 2002 to 2004 era, they were probably still too young, and it was probably still mostly designers who were carryovers from other lines or from, just other, like, we talked about the similarities between G.I. Joe Extreme and G.I. Joe vs. Cobra proportions. Not articulation, but proportions. It's possible that Extreme people were still working at Hasbro and still had influence on G.I. Joe. Whereas by the 25th anniversary line, I wouldn't be surprised if the people that really wanted the ultimate Snake Eyes figure they never got now had the chance to say, like, put this on the schedule. We need to make this exact toy exactly like it was in the 80s. And it wasn't just the toys. The packaging now was throwbacks. Like, everything about it was throwbacks to that experience of finding these toys on the shelves. And it brought in, I think, a lot of collectors who just seeing the whole package together and picking up a toy the way they remembered it, even though it was a completely different construction of that those characters.
Well, and nostalgia has a pattern, and it was very interesting. I talked to a professional collector about this. One of the reasons why I'm getting rid of my collection now is that what you loved at 15, you'll love at 50.
Hmm.
And if you loved it at 15 and you wanted it but couldn't have it, at 50, you have the money to buy it. And so you'll have this pattern of Pokemon cards going, okay, well, they were popular and then they
Hmm.
weren't popular. And now everyone who loved that now has a job. They're not going to be buying a house because they're of that generation that will never afford one. So they have money that they can spend on things like that. And then it will peter out as life, starts to cost more. And then it will eventually, when they start retiring and are at the top of their income, it will go really, really high. And so that's true of everything. It's true of stamps. It's true of anything was sold as a collectible. So we're hitting our 50s,
Hmm.
right? So the people are basically at peak income who grew up on this. And they'll go out and they'll spend $30 on a figure because it reminds them of what it is, or it's something they could not have obtained when they were kids, but they have the money to do it now. And I think Hasbro really, really understands that, like really does recognize that maybe this isn't about necessarily always selling to kids. Maybe it's about hitting that pocket of dollars that are there of people who just want to relive a part of their childhood. So,
So the media that was tied into G.I. Joe at the time was very different from the toys. The toys were
ooh,
100% nostalgia based, and then the movies and the cartoons that we got at the time were not. They were all trying to reinvent G.I. Joe. So Resolute being the exception. So G.I. Joe Resolute was an animated series that was inspired by how the original Clone Wars, I forget if it's the Clone Wars or just Clone Wars. Those are two separate series. One of them has they were like 3-minute episodes that would then, when watched all together, would create a full series. But they were serialized short scenes,
I'm
basically.
gonna grab my
And so
battery.
Resolute
Yeah.
was intended to be that, and then wasn't. It was just kind of like we never found the time slot, so we're just airing the whole thing and then selling it as a DVD. But G.I. Joe Resolute used throwback designs with a more mature writing style to it, and a more mature tone.
Is that the one I believe where in the first episode, like they blow up the flag and everybody dies and all that kind of stuff? Like it was this really, really
That's extreme. There was an attack on the flag, and they were like, Bazooka was supposed to be watching out for it. Why didn't he do it? And they found Bazooka had been poisoned, killed by Storm Shadow, which allowed for this attack. Yeah, that's the one.
like so that was pretty like that was okay. Wow, this is quite serious. This is that set the tone very well for it.
So a couple of things about G.I. Joe Resolute. It's worth noting Warren Ellis, who was a huge name in comics at the time, wrote it. It was
Wow.
directed by Joaquin dos Santos, who was a director on Avatar: The Last Airbender, Legend of Korra, and then one of the showrunners on Voltron: Legendary Defender. And you can kind of see the same idea of like make this the show that you wanted it to be in the '80s when you were watching it, or how you remember it being. And also fascinating. I don't have the cast list handy, but there's only like 5 voice actors who did the entire. Yeah, yeah. If you rewatch it, you realize just how many people. Like it's shocking how many voices each of those 5 actors covered, and so many of them are like reminiscent of what they sounded like in the '80s. Tunnel Rat especially, it feels like they went out of their way to capture the Tunnel Rat from the movie, even though he was probably one of the least significant characters that we saw in the series. Destro had more of a Scottish accent that time. He had a bit of a Sean Connery feel to him. But yeah, Resolute, I think was what G.I. Joe fans really wanted the future of G.I. Joe to look like. And instead, the next year we got the Rise of Cobra. Any strong feelings about G.I. Joe's first live action movie?
Well, I liked it. I really did. I really liked it. It was I love when the figures came out. It was a like just it hitting and having these. I remember walking through Walmart and the center of the aisle was all GI Joe, and it was all these GI Joe figures. I collected it fairly heavily, and still have quite a few figures from it. And I don't know. It feels like it was just as good as it was when I watched it again recently.
Hmm?
The second one didn't feel as good as it felt in the theater, and so I'm not sure exactly what they captured, but I was also really open to the changes that they were making to it. A lot of people were not my GI Joeing it, and it really. I think that that's where kind of the mixed overall sentiment for it goes, but they needed a big, flashy movie like this. They needed a Battleship, right? Battleship is an excellent action movie that flunked really hard that they did, but it was just this really big, energetic thing, and so I liked it. I liked it very much, and had Brendan Fraser in it. So right there,
Very briefly. Some of the things that I liked about it, I thought that the selection of Cobra characters was good, and for the most part, they looked right. The not having Cobra Commander in it was a bit of a disappointment, but that's kind of the whole movie serves as the origin story of Cobra Commander. And what I really liked is that the plot is clever. Like Cobra Commander is playing Destro, Destro is playing the Joes, and you never quite know what Destro's up to. Like it, at one point, Duke accuses him of, "Oh, you're trying to put yourself into the White House," and Destro's like, "You're not seeing the big picture." And it's true. There was a whole arc going on. There was an evil scheme going on that was not obvious, and it was fun how it unfolded. My issue was it with the movies more on the G.I. Joe side, in that the character selection was not great, and the designs were awful. Everyone was just in the same black armor, and that totally missed the point of everyone having this cool, unique look. Really, the only character that stood out was Snake Eyes, and they made the mistake of giving him the lips, which was the one thing that if you could change about that version 2 figure, it was getting rid of the lips. But then when you were talking about the toy aisle, some of my favorite G.I. Joe Rise of Cobra toys are the ones not based on the characters from the movie. That's Shipwreck, where he's got the armor, but he's got the blue camo pants, and he's got like the backpack that both holds all of his scuba gear and can then deploy into a really cool scuba gear. And he's got the boonie cap, so instead of the sailor hat that he had in the '80s, that redesigned from the Devil's Due comics, like that is one of my favorite Shipwreck figures, one of my favorite figures from the line. And I just wish if they were going with this like standardized armored look, they had done more like that. They had said like, we need to make sure we absolutely capture who these characters are, give each of them something that stands out about them, so that when you then get to the toy aisle, you say, I'm looking for the one with the blue pants, or I'm looking for the one with the green camo, so that you don't have to explain to the grandmothers. It's like, he wants Duke, which is the guy that from the neck down looks like Batman, just like everyone else, but from the neck up, crew cut white guy. So you're looking for a crew cut white guy head. There were 3 of them. Good luck figuring out which one your kid specifically wants.
well, the thing I liked about it, though, from a customer's point of view, is that with everything being black and featureless, it's a canvas.
Mm.
It's something that you can start building on. It's start something that you can add new heads that were it was completely backwards compatible with the 25th anniversary line. So starting to build out things within that mythos and using that energy and using that kind of aesthetic was actually pretty easy. And the other thing that was really cool about it, and jumping forward to 2011, The Pursuit of Cobra, is that they hit a hard point with those figures where they at Toys R Us they flunked. And so you had GI Joes that you could go out and many years later, like we're talking like 30 years later almost. Well, let's see, 83 to 2013. Um, you can go out and buy $4 GI Joes again. And so you could get them, and at $4, you could buy all you want, customize them, throw them, throw some of the accessories out if you didn't want them, mix them and match them, put them any way that you want. And that gave, as a customizer, you a whole new set of tools with which to play with and create custom tools, or sorry, custom toys. So it was very interesting. Whenever it flumps hard, the cost comes down to obtain it, and as soon as there's low cost materials, then creativity abounds, and that is, I think, one of the things that I really liked about it as well. Sometimes when they fail, I succeed, and that is really so you can take there's a lot of benefit out of when they win and create awesome product that you want to have on the shelf, and when they lose and they create cheap clearance product that you can then bend to your own needs. So,
Here's the problem. For me personally, as someone who lives in Quebec, once the sales start dipping, they stop doing the bilingual packaging and it just dries up immediately in Quebec. So everywhere around me is talking about finding all these cheap Joes, and yet whenever this happens, like towards the end of any line, except weirdly Sigma 6 became a little easier to find in Quebec. I don't know why towards the end. But yeah, it suddenly becomes I now have to either choose whether I am committing to this line that is clearly dying and is going to be much harder to shop for, or just accept that this last couple of waves I'm never going to get. Like, I don't think we got Pursuit of Cobra in Quebec.
yeah, we had it for $1.99 on sale at yeah. So the people say this rare Kamakura version, right, which is Kamakura, the blue hat and black armor, and then
Yeah.
blue pants, all that kind of stuff. They were $1.99. I bought tons of them just to
Wow.
take them apart because they were such a nice base figure. And now I have, like, if I'm going to try and sell these things, I have to piece them all back to their original size and then find out where they're because they came with like 15 different accessories. And, in your game, they can only carry 6 hands worth of accessories. These are more like 35 hands worth of accessories that they were coming with. And then matching them all up is such a challenge. But yeah, I mean, they were really inexpensive here for a short period of time. And that just happened to be one where there was a Toys R Us pop-up within walking distance of my work. So I ended up, once again, kind of stocking up on those particular pieces. So, but yeah, very different experiences apparently, depending on where you
Yeah.
were in the country.
What's also unfortunate is that I love the Pursuit of Cobra designs. So, for those who don't know, after Rise of Cobra, before Retaliation, Hasbro just continued to create things in the G.I. Joe movie universe, but it was all original concepts, or it was carry forward of concepts from, the vintage line. And these are some of the best designs of these characters. And a lot of the times it was taking like actual modern military or slightly sci-fi, like taking what the aesthetic of Rise of Cobra looked like, and then not having to do Rise of Cobra, but to say, if this is the world of G.I. Joe, here's what these characters that exist in that world look like. And they came up with, frankly, much better designs than the movie did, and just great action figures overall. This is also around the era that the Rise of Cobra video game came out, which I don't want to gloss over because that might be my favorite G.I. Joe video game. People do not like it, and yet I think it is loaded with Easter eggs for longtime fans. It is loaded with cool designs. There is a larger cast for the Rise of Cobra video game than there was for G.I. Joe Resolute, and like they put way more characters into the movie or into the video game than they needed to. Like, you have Stalker giving you instructions, you have both dial tone and mainframe giving you tech support, and it's just cool to have this huge cast of characters, which to me is one of the things that makes G.I. Joe so great.
I have very fond. So this was when my son was just getting into video games, and it was the first one that we actually played cooperatively together on the Nintendo, whichever Nintendo it was at the
The
point. It was,
Wii.
it was the Wii as opposed to the Switch. Yes. So yeah, we played that on the Wii and absolutely loved it. And there was like comic covers to find and all of that kind of stuff. There's another one that's just recently come out, Operation Blackout, which we'll talk about again later, but we played that together as well. And that felt literally like nostalgia of playing this particular game because it was that enjoyable. So yeah, not a bad word to say about it. I have very, very fond memories of that.
Now, mixed in around this time was G.I. Joe Renegades. So when Transformers Prime and My Little Pony Friendship is Magic came out, there was the third pillar of Hasbro's three big brands that they released was G.I. Joe Renegades. The idea was that these would be the three new series that would move forward, and they really only could afford two because G.I. Joe Renegades was canceled before the first episode aired, from what the voice cast said. But a whole episode, or sorry, a whole season, or I guess a half season, was produced, and so they aired the first half, and then back-ended the second half, and eventually did release it. G.I. Joe Renegades is, nobody will deny it, G.I. Joe A-Team. And the first couple of episodes are rough because there's a lot of allusions to the movie, a lot of allusions to the stuff people didn't like from the movie, which is Ripcord being included as a main cast member and BioVipers being the big threat. And so, yeah, there was this, again, anime-influenced look, moved away from what made G.I. Joe great, and left a really bad first impression, which is rare. G.I. Joe usually leaves a good first impression. This one did not. And so it took about 3 or 4 episodes for people to realize, oh, this is a really cool series. And we were denied that because of how rough the start was.
I loved it from the first episode.
Oh, yeah?
I completely disagreed with everybody. I thought this was amazing. There are a couple of bad points in it, but overall, I enjoyed the tone. I loved them being being the underdogs. I loved them having to make rough decisions. I even loved, from a certain extent, the fact that they stole an enemy vehicle and were running around in it, and dealing with the complexities of it. It was a really sophisticated cartoon. It really showed Cobra as having the upper hand and being smart. And there's nothing more interesting than a smart enemy that you have to beat. So great depiction of the Baroness, great depiction of basically, I loved every bit of it, except for how short it was. And I don't think that it will ever come as close to its impact on the thing of Friendship is Magic, or any of that era of Transformers stuff. But it was great. I had absolutely no complaints about it. But unfortunately, it was not going to be long lived.
Yeah, it is my favorite characterization of Scarlet in anything. And I loved what they did with Snake Eyes. Because the Joes were these renegades on the run. And then Snake Eyes was this mysterious element that even they didn't quite get how he factors into everything. Only Scarlet really trusted him, and everyone didn't really trust Scarlet, but they were all kind of thrown into this lot together, so they were forced to work together. Funny enough, it's basically the same cast as Sigma 6, at least how it started off, in that Scarlet Duke, Roadblock, although it was heavy duty on Sigma 6 because of copyright reasons, and Tunnel Rat and Snake Eyes, who I may have already mentioned, being the main characters. Yeah, being this small group, and yet, it really works as a core team. I loved what they did with Tunnel Rat. Tunnel Rat was really entertaining in that series. One thing that I think, again, they did wrong early on, one of the things they said leading up to it is that they wanted it to feel like 90s X-Men, in that you had your core group of characters, but every episode would feature a familiar character. And unfortunately, the first character that they did was Steeler, who is super obscure, and was just a guy named Ralph Pulaski, whatever his name is. He didn't look like Steeler. He wasn't a guy in the military. He was just some guy in that town named Ralph. And later, when we got Airtight, you definitely recognized Airtight. And when Zartan and the Dreadnoks showed up. But again, those first couple of episodes just made some mistakes, I think, that really cost the series from really catching on with the people.
Yeah, and I mean, you're never going to hit 100% of it with it. I think they were trying to be subtle at the beginning,
Yeah.
then realized that they were doing a G.I. Joe cartoon, and subtlety was probably not the best way to go. But none of that took away from me because I wasn't really expecting it. I wasn't looking for the Easter eggs. I was just looking at this plot of this good story, and I was engaged. I liked I liked the characters. I liked the interplay between them. They had the fight, but not the fight. Like a fight that creates dramatic tension but doesn't destroy their ability to be a team. All of that sort of stuff was done really well in that, and I think it was a very sophisticated cartoon. I enjoyed it. No complaints.
All right, it's 2012, we saw the release of Retaliation, the second G.I. Joe movie, which I wish Retaliation had Rise of Cobra's budget and momentum behind it, and possibly direction, because I think it had the better story, it had the better cast, It had the better choice of characters, and there was love. There was love for GI Joe behind it, especially in the Snake Eyes and Storm Shadow scenes. But I don't think it came together as well as a movie.
Yeah, I would agree on that. I think that every time you put Dwayne Johnson in something,
Hmm.
if he actually cares about it, you're going to notice it, and absolutely did. The denouement and it was awesome. It is like I think back to it numerous different times. I think about when Ray, what's his name? He smacks.
Stevenson.
Yeah, Ray Stevens is
Yeah.
smacks him. That's for raising taxes. You don't pay taxes. It's not always about me. One of my favorite lines from a bad guy ever, because you have this unambiguously bad guy, but he's like, yeah, you know what? It's not just about me, but it was, and like I said, the denouement where he blows up, gets them to blow up their own missiles. That was like, it was really grippingly good. And then you have random tanks firing around, and you have like, there seems to be so much stuff that probably should have hit the cutting room floor. And so many pieces where there should have been a better connection between the person and the content, and then there wasn't. And that's only noticeable because it was so tight on other people. It was so well done on other pieces. And then you have Bruce Willis come in, who is very much not really sure why he's there, and not really comfortable in the role, and kind of just phoning it in. It's like you could see he kept checking his phone to see whether or not the paycheck cleared. It was very much a phone it in. And you can't have people who are super passionate alongside people who really don't care. Or it just makes the very passionate people seem too extreme, and the really don't care people really noticeable. So that was my take on it.
There was also so when everyone gets wiped out at the beginning, I feel like there was a different cut that it was clearer that Duke died and it was clearer that everyone got wiped out, because it just kind of seemed like Duke's in this movie, the camp gets hit, and then nobody's like, oh no, Duke's dead. Like they just something. It feels like they wanted to play it a little safer and not kill off their main character, but he wasn't in the rest of the movie, and it's not just there were some storytelling beats that were missed. And I also feel like I do feel like The Rock was really engaged in it. I remember during the lead up to the advertising, Rock was all over it, which is nice because Rise of Cobra did not have that. It felt like people were kind of making fun of the fact that they were in a G.I. Joe movie, which was really annoying. Even JD and I on his podcast one time, he was pointing out that even Brendan Fraser, when they told him, oh, you're going to be gung ho, and he was like, he looks like a village person, so they just gave him a different character. And that was promoting the movie. Like, it didn't feel right. But The Rock felt like he loved Retaliation. But I have a feeling that because The Rock loved it, he then took on the role that was supposed to be for Flint and became both the leader and the heavy. And Flint just became this extra guy who had a crush on Lady J, I guess. Like, what was his point in it? And as a big Flint guy, it just he felt redundant, and he felt more like Falcon than Flint.
Fair enough. Yeah, absolutely. Like he was basically eye candy at the end. But I mean, roadblock for people of color, like unambiguous hero, right?
Yeah.
Amazing figure, totally featured, absolutely skilled. Like they even did he fires the 50 caliber hand holding it, which is impossible for anyone but him, right? Like that is an incredibly important figure to people who didn't necessarily have a lot of people to look up to at the time. And so I get where that love comes from. And some of the other stuff, they just didn't have that connection with any type of character like that. The guy who played Flint, I didn't even really know he was Flint. I had to actually think about who you were talking about, and that tells you what kind of a performance it was. It was so the levels of passion were just so different, and I think that is going to kill the place. Even I think within Rise of Cobra, everybody not really wanting to be there kind of worked in a way, because everybody's energy basically hit the same level of it could have been better.
Yep.
But there was nothing wildly glaringly out. Like there wasn't just the one guy who really wanted this to work and nobody else was particularly interested. But
no, you know what? Breaker stands out as the one person who seems happy to be there. He has a lot of clever lines. He's a lot more of a subtle performance than you expect from it. And he is the one guy that I was like, every time I watch it, I like his performance a little better.
Very much. It's, he, why isn't he talking? He's got a vowel sound.
Yeah.
What is it? He didn't say.
Yeah, that's a great line.
Fantastic line. Best line in the whole thing. Well, okay. Nice shoes was also a good one. But I mean, it is just there are a couple of people who are having fun there, and everybody else is just pulling down the paycheck.
Yeah.
And you can tell. Like I really think that that would have been a better if central casting had been better. It would have been a better movie. And I think that that's something. But anyway, yeah, they are what they are.
Yeah.
And if you're really looking for depth and Oscar-winning performances in something that's based on a kid's toy, well, probably want to look at Transformers because you're not going to find it in G.I. Joe. And I think we're all okay with that.
Well, so going back to something I said earlier, I feel like G.I. Joe lasted even though it has one of the more basic concepts of all the 80s properties because it over-delivered early. Like what Larry Hama did and what Sunbow did with the animated series was some of the best of that kind of content at the time. And so for the G.I. Joe movies to just be kind of middle ground, it didn't feel right to us. And yet other people are like, this is what I expect from G.I. Joe. And that's kind of heartbreaking from us knowing that G.I. Joe, when handled right, it, like really surpasses expectations in a way that makes it so memorable.
It doesn't talk down to you.
Yeah.
It forces you to come up to meet it. And that is, I think, what its lasting legacy was. And I don't know if anyone says X-Men comics did that.
Yeah.
And that's
Good call.
still here.
All right. One other thing that I want to bring up in 2012 to 2013, there was a G.I. Joe game app called G.I. Joe Battleground. And the reason I want to bring it up is because it was a card-based game that had hundreds of pieces of original art that is still some of the most iconic looks of these characters, really capturing the action figures. And if you just Google a character from G.I. Joe, if they were in the card game, odds are the G.I. Joe Battleground art is going to be one of the first things that shows up. And so I don't know a lot of people that played it. I played it for a little while and then kind of got tired of the, like, you can have 4 turns now and then wait 4 hours. It's like, I just want to play the game. But the art will, like, people will forget that this art came from Battlegrounds. They will just know this art for years to come.
I was obsessed with it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I will never actually pay money for games like that because, that's towards the end, you could kind of tell it was failing. They had all of these deals. I'm like, oh, maybe I should put mine on. Well, no, I'm not. My goal here is to enjoy it and get the contents there. I love the art from it. A lot of it was hidden behind a multi-star system. Near the end, they just went, all right, this thing's going to die in 2 months. You can unlock everything. And so I went in because I had all the points and everything stored to do it. And I downloaded and kept copies of all of the art.
Nice.
So all of the white border, when stuff would appear, it would come in a white border for the first time. So it actually was really good for putting into websites and things. And then it would pop with background on it. I kept all of it that I'd unlocked. And so I have like a folder of all of those art pieces because they are beautiful. They're absolutely gorgeous art. And the game itself was just a way to kill time and a drain, and you had to go around and do things, and it's like every other game of its type. But it was a gorgeous game, and yeah, I'm gonna the electronic files for those I will probably keep as long as I keep any files because they're just that beautiful.
All right, we are almost at the modern day where G.I. Joe has once again been resurrected on the Toy Isle and is doing pretty well. Despite a lot of things, we'll talk about that in a second. For a little blip, there was the 50th anniversary, which was still in that same body type of the 25th anniversary and the rise of Cobra through Retaliation. I'm just because it was this like last gasp of that era. That's why I've included it on here. There are some interesting action figures from that time, but for the most part, I don't think it's very well or even often remembered. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on it.
Zero interaction with it. It was mostly in Toys R Us's that ours had closed, and then it reopened again. But there was no reasonably easy way for me to access any of those figures. And at that point, I'd lost the glow. I'd lost the enthusiasm for collection. I had way more than enough figures at this point, and then you sometimes get to a point where a collection becomes a burden, and I was going through one of those burden phases. But so I wasn't really that interested in it. But apparently, some of the figures are absolutely the very top end of what you could get out of the articulation level that they're at. And honestly, at that point, they weren't sparking any joy for me, so I didn't have any interaction with them.
I will give a shout out to the fact that Hasbro made Sightline, which was based on Gary Goggles Head, a friend of ours from the community who had died very young and suddenly, and nobody was expecting it. And he was such a major part of the connection between the Hasbro designers and the community. Like, he was debunking a lot of myths and assumptions that people were making. He was getting from the source information and trivia about the designing of the line. Like, he came in very suddenly. Like, he wasn't on the same era of G.I. Joe fans that we were in on Bivouac and Joe Customs. He came out onto the scene later, provided so much information, and then died suddenly. And like, so many people know him and have fond memories of him, despite the fact that he wasn't in the fandom for that long. And it is really cool that Hasbro, celebrated him by naming a new original character after him. So his real name is Gary Head. He goes by Gary Goggles online, and so Sightline's file card name is Gary Goggles.
Hmm.
And this is one of the only action figures from that era that I do still have. He came with the Sky Striker, and it was a big set. Let's see, there was a Hiss tank in it. Like, the sets were very big and strange, and so I managed to get the Sky Striker and Ace and Sightline from that set. I don't know if I have I probably have. No, I think I got the full box. I don't think I bought it piecemeal. So anyway, I appreciate that, and it's a good looking action figure, and hopefully Sightline shows up in other media in the future, because it would be cool to carry on that legacy.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and 2020, G.I. Joe came back to the toy shelves in a 6-inch line called G.I. Joe Classifieds, which I remember you were very pessimistic about when it first came out, but it is on its 5th year now, which is one of the longest running G.I. Joe toy lines. In fact, the second longest running after only the vintage line that went for 12 years. And it is still going strong. They've made announcements for stuff that's coming out in the next couple of years. So what is your take now on G.I. Joe Classified?
Well, it's an excellent example of how I can be wrong about things.
Sometimes.
Because I underestimated the appeal of 6-inch figures to people who grew up with wrestling figures. And the wrestling figures were always in 6-inch. That's what made them fun to play with. They're less about the vehicles and more about the physicality of that particular character. No one is ever going to deny that the classified figures aren't the best looking, best articulated, best equipped figures that have ever been released at any scale for this, even including the original ones where you could have, they were designed around clothing and equipment. But I looked at that price point and went, there's no way that anyone's going to be paying $40 to $50 for a figure. But that also didn't take into account that the Star Wars Black figures, which were already wildly successful. This was not a huge reach out for them when they were already showing that the fandom, which for Star Wars is always a little bit older than G.I. Joe, because Star Wars is a little bit older than G.I. Joe. So it's a good predictor of where G.I. Joe could come. And it was massively, massively successful by any measure. And there are more people I know of whom I'm on podcasts with and all that sort of stuff who are like displaying very proudly their collections of classified. Everyone's trying to push me to get the classified Raptor.
Raptor?
I love everything about it. I have no interest in owning it. But it is one of those things where I can appreciate the beauty of it without having any desire to possess it, because 6-inch figures take up a whole lot of space. Mm-hmm. And the price point is just, it's outrageous to me. It's what 10 figures should cost, not one. So in my 1980s brain, that is the one that still buys toys. So it puts me in a position where, I can absolutely enjoy that people enjoy them. And I can take a lot of joy out of how much people are really getting out of this and how much it's bringing things back. But it's not for me.
One of the things that was pointed out, the classified lines, because it is in the same scale as Star Wars Black, like you mentioned, and also the Marvel Legends, which had a resurgence recently and have been just become the default way to get into your Marvel toys. And what McFarlane's doing with DC is also in the same scale. And just in general, if a new toy line comes out, odds are it's going to be this 6-inch scale. Like the Dungeons and Dragons movie figures came out in this scale. The Indiana Jones figures, they didn't do well, but this was just like, this is what action figures are right now. And the thing about classified is that they have accessories. And almost any toy line has very few. So the Star Wars ones will have a blaster or a lightsaber and very little else. Most superheroes will not come with anything except for maybe if it's really important for the character's superpower set. But every single G.I. Joe classified figure will come with 10 accessories. Like some of the ones that come with 3 or 4, which is way more than you'll get from any Marvel Legends figure. Those are the ones that people are complaining don't come with enough stuff. And so that is one of the ways that classified is separating itself from the other toys out there. there is just more you can do when your figure comes with accessories, and accessories take on a new personality and add to the personality of the figure. Early on, the classified figures were once again trying to reinvent G.I. Joe, but you could see the cues that were taken from the vintage line. So that first five figures that were released was Duke, and it was clearly based on Duke version 1, but had like techno accessories added on there and details, which for whatever reason was very like knees down heavy. If you look at the first four lines, the first four Joes from the line, or not Snake Eye so much, but Duke, Roadblock, and Scarlet, they have like mechanical knee pads and these giant mechanical boots, but not as much from the waist up, which was, you would figure it would be more evenly distributed. So that's why
Well,
I've always thought that first line was kind of weird.
that was very much for technical reasons, right? They wanted it
Yeah.
to be heavy on the bottom so it would stand on its own because they knew
Mm.
that from the very beginning, this was a line to be posed on shelves. It has to stand up on its own. It can't, it can't do that. So they went cautious at the beginning, making them very bottom heavy, like a Spawn figure,
Hmm.
where it's designed to stand there, and if it falls over easily, then a quick push on that little rack behind you could give you about a 45-minute job.
Oh,
Um,
no, that would
so
be a 45-week job fixing
and
everything.
so, well, it depends on how hard the push, I guess, was. But the point is that even a nudge, right, that you end up doing stuff. So they wanted something that was going to be sturdy on the shelves, and that's what those products look to me like products that were designed to be sturdy on the shelves. But now they've taken a little bit more chance with it because they're now seeing enough people, displaying them, and that don't really care if one or two fall over. And I think that that's freed them up to be a little bit more tight to what it is at 3.5 figures. 3.5 figures were never meant to stand on their own. That's why they came with little stands where you just peg them into their heels so they wouldn't fall over. These ones don't come with stands like that because they don't, but they're still standing on their own. And I think that's
They often fall. I've had to buy custom made stands for them.
so anyway, but people like them better than the ones that are designed to stand on their own. They would prefer to have them be visually clean and visually like the original figures or visually like the new designs of figures. And yeah, I think that's spoken. But I mean, people are buying them in droves.
Yeah.
So
Classified's been around long enough that it's had an arc as a toy line where it started with that, like, we're going to base it clearly on the original figures, but we're going to update things to the point where Hasbro, most of the feedback they were getting was like, everything I like about it is the vintage stuff. Everything I hate about it is this new stuff you've added. And so slowly they just became carbon copies of the original figures. But more recently, they've started taking risks once again and introducing some characters that are more obscure or from different eras. Like we've gotten Agent Helix and Shadow Tracker. I've gotten action figures, and Shadow Tracker's action figure is extremely hard to find, and it is frustrating because it was a Walmart exclusive that just Walmart's decided not to carry. And so there's this amazing action figure that I would love to get my hands on, but I do not have it. But anyway, as they started taking more risks and going with more redesigns, they introduced the retro line. So it is 100% authentic to the original figures and packaged on a card that is just like the 80s toy line cards. To the point that if you didn't know what these figures looked like packaged and you had just a row of them out of their package, some of them you would look at and say like, well, that must have been retro because like that Shipwreck is exactly like Shipwreck. Nope, that was just a regular release Shipwreck. But then there was some figures that got redesigns are now out as retro figures.
and this is the sophistication of their social media trolling and reviewing and all that kind of stuff, where they say, "Look, we can sell the same figure 5 times. We package it 4." We know how we don't do that because we learned that in spy troops and all that kind of stuff. We know what fails, but we do know what succeeds, and it's giving people what they want, piece by piece, slowly, and multiple different releases.
Yep.
And you'll buy one because you want it, and then you'll be dissatisfied with it, and then the one with the proper colored gloves and the right shoes comes out, and you'll buy it again, and then the one that is the ultimate one that you wanted from the first part comes out, and you'll buy it a third time. And they've done this so many times, and it works every time. So that's that is they figured out what the success formula is listen to people and then give them piece by piece what it is that you've got. And what people generally want is a nostalgia, but there's also some really big upgrades in some of these figures that allow them to just do things that the old ones couldn't. And like somebody else made the joke, it's like with working wallet and real working credit cards, like they can go down to such a fine level of detail
Mm-hmm.
that they can do things that you would never ever have expected them to do otherwise.
So there's been a couple of things that they've done that I think they've really nailed that formula that you're talking about. So one of the things that's frustrated me with past G.I. Joe lines is when it was just over reliant on the Dukes and the Snake Eyeses and like the A-list cast. And Sigma Six was at its worst for this because there were only a couple of of vehicles. There was an ATV which came with a Duke figure, and there was a parachute which came with a Duke figure, and there was a repaint of the parachute which came with Snake Eyes, and I already had 50 of each of those figures. What they're doing now is that the more significant figures, so like the $100 vehicles, the $60 deluxe packs, those are obscure characters, and they are making them the coolest character. Like Naugahyde, they packed them in with multiple animals, they packed them in with all those accessories. Road Pig as well. Like you would figure they would save the stuff, like the most expensive figures would be the most popular ones. But no, they are making these characters more popular by making them the expensive ones. And it's also the only way they can actualize characters like Raptor, Naugahyde, and Road Pig. So it's this will probably be the only ones of these figures they get. And so if you really want those figures, at least you're getting your money's worth from these deluxe versions of them.
Yeah, no, fantastic. And something that wasn't on your list, but we're probably going to have to talk about anyway, Super 7.
Oh
Um,
yeah. Sorry, go on.
but I mean, within classified, there at when you got a $40 price point
Mm-hmm.
and a really, really, really engaged fan base, you can do stuff. You can make a business case for doing something that is so incredibly detailed and ridiculously niche, but cool. Right. And as long as you can sell that cool factor and know that you're going to sell it to people who are really interested in the product, and you've got the online proof to say that people are asking for it, you can get a lot of stuff greenlit. And they are. And so you can have a giant alligator with, articulation.
Yes.
Like all of these things are things and then you can release it in Python Patrol colors because of course you can. You've already got the molding. So they can do this, and it's got to be making money. They're still plastic. They're not made out of gold or anything, but they're being the price point just allows that kind of like we're not quite at the collectibles level, but it used to be the $100 GI Joe figures were the ones where every single little detail was there. We're like halfway there with some of these figures, and we're all the way there with others. So they can really afford to create these as collectibles with all of the various different little pieces to it. And in many ways, that's freeing. The question is, can people continue to still buy them when a lot of people are struggling with, rent and food? But
Yep.
the passion's there. The passion is absolutely there, and the engagement is there, and the company is doing a good job with it. And Pulse is definitely, tracking the pulse of what is going on, and puts in a lot of different gives them a lot of options to be able to create good things and have the case to do so. But
Yeah.
yes, Super 7.
Well, I just want to bring up Pulse
Oh, yep,
because
yep.
you could definitely. There's a measuring stick where they did the Sky Striker, which did okay. It funded. I bought it and regret it. It is one of the big purchase items that I regret, and it's very rare. I have a few big purchase items, and usually I'm happy with them. This one did not feel significantly different from the Sky Striker I bought a few years ago, which had the Sightline figure, and I'm more happy with that Sightline figure than I am with the $300 Sky Striker that I bought at the last minute on a whim because it was like, oh, is it or good a fund or is it not? And I kind of got pulled into the hype. And yeah, disappointed overall in the pretty meteor, like middle ground thing that I paid premium prices for. And then the Hiss Tank came out, and the Hiss Tank funded right away. The classified scale Hiss Tank funded right away. I was more excited. I own it. I am much happier with the Hiss Tank than I am with the Sky Striker. And this was funding at the same time as a Star Wars Black Rancor failed to fund. And so
Mhm.
Hasbro could clearly see like interest in 3 3/4 inch GI Joe. It's kind of there. Interest in Star Wars Black seems to be fading. Interest in classified is there. Like it's one of their most successful ones yet, and it's no surprise that as soon as the His Tank funded, suddenly Hasbro put a lot more into the classified line. Super Seven.
Okay. Yeah, no, and you're 100% correct that through Pulse, it just represents the fact that they're kickstarting stuff, right? The fact that they're like this is it's the biggest toy company in the world, I think. I mean, they've certainly bought everything I've ever loved, and now own it. So it and yet they're managing innovation through the things that small businesses do, right? They're kickstarting things that. that shows to me a level of sophistication in the organization that it's not just one big organization making a whole bunch of choices about one big set of brands. They've actually got a lot of areas for experimentation in place, a lot of areas for engagement in place. Sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't, but it definitely tells them more about their customers and where it is that they should be putting their investments. So I feel that that's the case. Now, and then on the other hand, you got Super 7. Now, I will start out by saying I detest Super 7 because it is
As a
everything
company?
I hated. No, no, not the
Oh,
company.
okay.
The products.
Okay.
Because they are everything that I hated about Star Wars figures, and went to G.I. Joe to avoid. And
Let's
so,
time out here. Super 7 has put out 3 lines of G.I. Joe. There's the Ultimates, which are very similar in scale to Classified, but they are cartoon aesthetic and like with softer details.
haven't even seen those yet.
Oh, okay. Then they put out the reaction figures, which are what you're talking about, Star Wars
Those are the
style,
ones.
very little articulation. And more recently, they've done the Reaction Plus, which I just happen to have Tomax and Zaymot within reach. And the Plus stands for the, where's the logo? Yeah, the Plus is modeled after the screwback to show that these are the O-ring
Oh,
articulated ones. These are the ones that are almost exactly like the 80s style,
wow.
which
Okay,
was
I didn't
apparently what
even
Super
know about
7
those.
originally wanted to do with the G.I. Joe license, but Hasbro told them they could not do the O-rings. But through, I don't know, a couple of years and I guess just different negotiating, Super 7 was eventually allowed to create this new Reaction Plus line, which are the closest we've gotten to G.I. Joe figures to the what 80s Hasbro was putting out, that other than what, let me start this over. They're the closest to Hasbro produced 80s style G.I. Joe figures that any company other than Hasbro has ever released.
And 100% like that, that's very impressive. I like that. The two things that I don't like about it were the original figures that we saw, because Reaction was out far before GI Joe was before they had the GI Joe license. They had the Aliens figures, the like all of the various different movie figures and things like that. Never appealed to me. GI Joe got them. They started doing all sorts of really cool, obscure stuff. And I'm like, well, that's kind of cool, but I don't like the figures. But the thing that got me was the Canadian pricing for them. Like we were looking at 20 to 21 to $25 per figure for what was effectively, 5 points of articulation figure. And I couldn't ever, no matter how obscure the figure was, no matter how cool it was, no matter how unique and niche to the interest was, I couldn't get behind it. I don't know I can't say anything bad about the company because I don't actually know anything about the company. But the product as it was presented was just so niche and so simple that it offended my sensibilities at its price point. And now I'm seeing that obviously there was a bigger plan here. There's obviously they wanted to do something and now they're able to do it. They've definitely proved to Hasbro that they can make a profit on the most simple things. They can probably make a much bigger profit on things that are a little bit more complex and a little bit better. So I'm very impressed with what I've seen here, but I didn't know about any of that right now because I'm of course not really tied into that part of the hobby anymore. I'm not a collector. I'm a person trying to divest themselves of a collection as opposed to add to it. And so I think that colors it. But I really felt like when I saw the first Super 7 figures on the shelf, I was like, oh, cool. They've made figures to stand on the edge of the flag. That's great. People with flags, they've always wanted those. And then I looked at them like, this feels like such a step back. It's such a massive step back in what we expect out of action figures. This feels like we're stepping into the 1970s again, and we can do so much more now. Like, why should we pay this much for this little thing? Because that just must be the branding dollars that they have to pay in order to get the licensing. So, anyway, that was it was a very my take on it was probably much different than everyone else's because I was in a different place as a collector when I started seeing it.
I would say that with the collectors that I speak with, most of them are not happy with the reaction line. Personally, one thing that was frustrating about the reaction line is that my Toys R Us's, my local ones, have gone all in on it, or at least went all in on a couple of waves. And there was just like this giant chunk of space dedicated to G.I. Joe, which you'd think I would be excited about, but I didn't want almost any of them. So I did end up getting, I forget what they called these guys. I think Cobra Shock Troopers. They're based on
Yeah,
the
very
Cobra
cool.
astronauts. And because he's armored, I can put him next to 3 3/4 inch ones with more articulation and say, well, his armor is hampering his movement. But like there was I loved so many of their character choices. I would have loved to have gotten Raven, the Strato Viper, the female Strato Viper from the animated series. They made a figure out of her. And if I put her in a Night Raven, then I would have been okay with the less articulation because she's mostly just from the shoulders up. But we never got her because local Toys R Us went so all in on those early waves and just sat there while they had this tiny space for the classified at the time. And anytime anything showed up, it was gone off the shelf right away. Like, classified was almost a victim of its own success in that they couldn't keep it on the shelf, and having bare shelf looks bad. So Toys R Us had to figure out either how much more to order to keep it in line. And this was during pandemic distribution. So even if they were ordering more, they probably weren't getting it. Or just to say, even though this is a high velocity product, we have to get rid of it because it's too high velocity for the space that we are giving to it.
And I mean, one of the, you talk about G.I. Joe's success being tied to world events, pandemic, bonus checks, plus the ability to not spend money on anything because you can't travel anywhere, go anywhere, or do anything, really definitely made, I think, action figure collecting, which you can do alone in person and online with people in order to connect, really did make a, I don't know, it gave it an opportunity. It provided some free money, like not free being free, but money that is not otherwise encumbered in other social activities to be able for people to devote to this at the beginning of its existence. And that may have, helped it catch on. So it might be another thing. Like we're going through all of these various different tragedies of politics and actions, like, and how this benefited GI Joe. But I think that part of this classified was that there were a lot of people who were happy to be inside and not interacting with people, but also very happy to be interacting with them online and
Well, and getting something familiar and comforting
in a world that wasn't really that any of those things.
Yeah.
So I think it's, I think G.I. Joe definitely has a place whenever, and I haven't really thought about this because this is an idea that you just introduced me to, but G.I. Joe is one of those things that you go to when the world is too complicated.
Which would be a great place to end it, even though I've got 3 or 4 more bullet points on here, but I think we can just wrap this up and maybe one day we'll get back to those.
Well, the other things that are there talking about, so the recent future, and we can probably talk about that next time we go there, or maybe do something more specific around our new interaction, because now we get to see each other and talk to each other a heck of a lot more than we used to, because we're both doing a podcasted RPG campaign, which I feel like somehow there's probably some stuff that you want to cover about that because I know that you know the designer and are a little otherwise engaged with it, but it is that's my next story. Like my next chapter of GI Joe was engaging it through the RPG game, and so that in of itself is probably its own episode.
Yeah, we are 2 hours and 23 minutes into this recording.
Well, and the funny thing is that I think that episode will be a lot closer to what the people who are actually tuned into this would expected to hear.
Yeah.
Because it is a lot more about the role playing game aspect. I think it is a wonderful place to go with this when you are so steeped in a knowledge and education and understanding of a particular property. Being able to go in and live the adventure is a huge deal. And that is certainly it's engaged me again in a property that was kind of like I'm looking at Rubbermaid bins and wondering how I'm going to get rid of them to I'm really engaged in this again. I want to know more about it. I want to engage with this Energon universe and all of the new comics, which all seem like a lot of energy's gone into them and are producing some really interesting stuff and has a really committed fan base. So
all right,
that's probably its own thing.
Yeah, officially then. We'll call this the jumping off point. So thank you for joining us for the latest episode of Upshift. If you'd like to hear more great gaming podcasts, you can go to nodirectionpodcast.com. There's also blogs, especially if you are an Essence 20 fan. You can check out my Essential Builds blog where I create popular culture characters using Essence